Imagine this. George Orwell, a guy who crafted a whole philosophical outlook revolving around one seemingly simple idea. Truth isn't up for debate. It's real. It's out there. And it's not swayed by what anyone thinks or feels. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But for Orwell, this wasn't just another belief. It was the bedrock for everything else he stood for. His politics, his morals, even how we connect with each other as humans. Orwell didn't come to this realization through pondering some theoretical ideas. Nope, it was through a tough life lesson. While he was involved in the Spanish Civil War, he saw firsthand how journalists and intellectuals could distort facts like crazy. Things he saw happening with his own eyes were either twisted, ignored, or completely made up in the media. There were stories of battles that never even went down, yet brutal acts that did happen were swept under the rug. This twisted reality was all because ideology blinded otherwise smart folks to plain facts. This was a real eye-opener for Orwell. It worried him sick that this whole idea of an objective truth was on its way out. It seemed like truth had become a tool for political gains. If your team said something was true, then it magically was, and if they said it wasn't, then it wasn't. Facts morphed into just another weapon in an ideological battle, and this terrified Orwell more than any physical threat ever could. He got it. When society lets go of truth, everything crashes down. You can't have justice without reliable facts for fair trials. Science? Forget it unless everyone agrees on the basics. Democracy? Impossible if voters don't have the right info. Even building trust in personal relationships falls apart without honesty. Once truth is out the window, civilization follows. Remember that iconic line from Orwell's 1984? Winston Smith says true freedom is saying 2 plus 2 makes 4. That simple math has a deeper meaning. It's about reality, no matter what's politically fashionable or popular at the time. 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that's how it is. It's truth beyond human whim or desire. In 1984, the oppressive regime tries to mess with this concept, arguing that 2 plus 2 equals 5 if they say so. They claim since they control minds, they control reality. But this isn't just fiction. Orwell saw similar tricks in the totalitarian regimes of his day. Stalin rewrote history, erasing his foes. Hitler preached that lies could become truth if repeated enough times. Orwell pushed back, insisting reality stands firm. You might convince people 2 plus 2 equals 5, but guess what? Bridges built on that math will still crumble. Deny battles all you like. The dead bodies aren't going anywhere. Claim your policies are smashing it, yet folks are still starving. Reality bites no matter what propaganda says. This stubbornness of reality gives hope to those clinging to the truth. Orwell believed regular folks have a knack for spotting truth when they see it. Common sense is a shield against twisted logic. Observing the world gives us unarguable truths. Stones are hard, water feels wet, and stuff falls when dropped. No amount of intellectual gymnastics can erase these facts. The trouble arises when people are taught to second-guess their own observations. Totalitarian regimes train citizens to trust official narratives over their own experiences. See something real but conflicting with the party line? Must have been your mistake. Remember something that doesn't match the official story? Your memory's off. Over time, people lose faith in their ability to tell real from fake, needing authorities to define their reality. Orwell spent his life fighting against this. He believed in sticking with the truth, trusting common sense, and resisting the manipulation of reality by those in power. He was adamant that every person has both the right and duty to see the world for what it truly is. No political force, regardless of its power, can alter the basic truths of life. No matter how cleverly designed, no ideology can transform falsehoods into facts. The world exists separately from what we think about it. This separation is what allows us to truly understand and know things. This belief in objective truth was at the heart of Orwell's entire philosophy. Politically, he based his beliefs on genuine observations of how various systems actually function in reality. His moral views focused on actual human needs rather than theoretical concepts. When it came to critiquing literature, he was interested in whether writers portrayed human experiences truthfully. Everything had to be tested against reality. If ideas sounded appealing but had negative outcomes, they were deemed useless. That's why Orwell could be a proponent of socialism while also critiquing socialist movements. He saw socialism as reflecting truths about human equality and cooperation. However, he also noticed that many socialist groups ended up corrupt, authoritarian, and deceitful. The truth behind socialist ideals didn't justify the lies told by their leaders. Orwell never felt he had to choose between truth and his political thoughts. He was adamant that real political advancement couldn't happen without being completely honest about both victories and setbacks. Part 2. Language as the Mind's Battleground. George Orwell stumbled upon a realization that intrigued philosophers for ages. Language doesn't just paint a picture of reality, it molds how we perceive and think about that reality. The words we have at our disposal determine the range of thoughts we can entertain. This light bulb moment transformed Orwell's view of politics because whoever controls language can shape our very consciousness. That's why any oppressive regime starts with redefining key words and phrases. Orwell saw this happen up close during his time as a journalist and political analyst. He observed how politicians twisted language to make it nearly impossible for opponents to express their ideas clearly. Complex political ideas were boiled down to hollow slogans, and meaningful distinctions were blurred by broad, vague statements. Over time, people lost the ability to think straight about politics, lacking the words to do so clearly. This wasn't just by chance, it was by design. Think about how political language gets used. When leaders want to make violence sound justified, they don't call it violence. Instead, they refer to it as peacekeeping, defensive action, or liberation. When describing opponents, they choose words packed with emotional power. Rebels are branded as terrorists, protesters as mobs, and critics as traitors. These word choices heavily influence how people feel about what's happening, often overshadowing the actual facts. Orwell envisioned where this manipulation might lead. What if a government could twist language to such an extent that certain thoughts were literally unthinkable? Imagine if words like rebellion, freedom, or individual rights vanished from the dictionary. What if terms like justice and truth were redefined to mean whatever those in power wanted? This chilling concept is what Orwell captured with Newspeak in 1984. It's the ultimate control over thought, a society where language is whittled down to the point where complex thought becomes unimaginable. Newspeak systematically cuts down the number of words to choose from. Hundreds of words disappear each year, forcing synonyms to merge and offering only one way to express each idea. As language simplifies, people lose the tools for intricate thinking, critical analysis, or independent judgment. The language becomes so barren that all that's left is basic thinking. But Orwell knew you don't need a totalitarian state to mess with language like this. Language can deteriorate simply through laziness or a lack of courage in our thinking. When we don't pay attention to the words we choose, we start losing grip of our own thoughts. We parrot what others say without really grasping it and latch on to their language, without checking if it truly serves us. Gradually, our ability to think for ourselves fades away. This is why Orwell puts such a premium on clear and precise writing. Good writing stems from clear thinking, which is fundamental to human freedom. When writing's a mess, it often reflects messy thinking. And messy thinking leads to poor choices, which result in negative outcomes for both the individual and society. The quality of language directly influences the quality of thought, and in turn, the quality of life itself. To safeguard language, Orwell developed some strategies. He championed using concrete words over vague ones, favoring shorter words and simpler sentences. He warned against cliches, empty metaphors, and pretentious vocabulary. He urged writers to continually ask themselves what they're really trying to say and if their words make it clear. Above all, they should never use language to mask their true intentions, either from their audience or themselves. Honest language leads to honest thinking. These guidelines aren't just for writers. They're relevant to anyone who communicates. Every person has a duty to use language clearly and truthfully. Whenever people keep tossing around empty phrases or buy into fake differences, they're making public discussions worse. But when someone sticks to clear definitions and true descriptions, they're actually keeping the groundwork for good dialogue alive. The fight for our freedom as humans happens bit by bit in every sentence. We all join in this fight every time we speak or write. Part 3. The way politics twists language. If what we say affects how we think, then those aiming to control thoughts have to mess with language first. Orwell saw this happening all over the place during the 1930s and 40s. Various political groups figured out they could sway public views by carefully picking words to frame big issues. This wasn't just your standard propaganda. No, it was way sneakier. It was about systematically ruining the tools people need to make sense of politics. Orwell pointed out a bunch of tricks that politicians use to mess with language. First up, they use euphemisms to hide harsh truths. So, mass killing turns into ethnic cleansing. Torture is rebranded as enhanced interrogation. A military invasion is spun as a police action. And exploiting economies morphs into development assistance. Each softening trick makes it tougher for folks to recognize the real deal. The nice-sounding words blunt the moral shock people should feel about terrible things. The next trick is purposefully making political language vague. Politicians master the art of speaking in vague terms that can't be easily debunked. They toss around words like freedom, democracy, justice, and security without ever pinning down their actual meanings. They promise progress, reform, change, and improvement, but don't really say what's going to be different. This vagueness does two things. It keeps politicians from making promises that could come back to bite them, and it lets different people project their wishes onto the politician's words. Everyone hears just what they want. Another tactic involves twisting the meanings of familiar words to fit political agendas. Freedom starts to mean whatever the government defines it as. Democracy is any system that claims to represent the people. Justice turns into whatever outcome benefits the powerful. Peace is just the absence of active fighting. These shifts in meaning aren't announced openly. They just slowly creep in through repeated use in speeches, news, and official papers. Eventually, the original meanings are forgotten. Orwell pointed out that intellectuals were especially prone to this kind of manipulation. They like to think of themselves as using fancy language and deep ideas, making them easy targets for arguments that sounded clever but were empty. Academic jargon turned into a way of ducking real thinking about tough issues. The more abstract the language got, the easier it was to ignore what was actually happening. Intellectuals could chat about the dialectics of historical materialism while ignoring starving people. Political talk also gets corrupted by messing up cause and effect. Politicians describe policy outcomes like they're natural disasters out of anyone's control. Unemployment is called a challenge instead of a policy screw-up. Poverty is a management issue, not an injustice. War is framed as inevitable rather than a choice by certain people with particular motives. This way of talking takes human decision-making out of the picture. It makes it seem like events just occur by themselves, without anyone pulling the strings. How can you hold anyone responsible if things just happen? Another way language gets twisted is by creating dozens of useless distinctions. Politicians chop up social classes into a bunch of subcategories like upper middle class, lower middle class, and working class, masking the core issues of poverty and wealth. Instead of talking about capitalism and socialism directly, they sprinkle in mixed economies or social market systems. These distinctions sound smart but often blur the real lines of power and resources. This complexity benefits those who profit from keeping things the way they are. Orwell also mentioned how political language picks up dying metaphors. Politicians often throw around phrases like towing the line, riding roughshod, and fishing in troubled waters, without ever considering the original images those words were meant to conjure. Over time, these metaphors have lost their vividness, but they still carry an emotional weight that can sway people's feelings on the issues being talked about. Even though they're not visually impactful anymore, they trick people into thinking the speech is vibrant, while actually numbing the imagination. It's like giving politicians a way to sound poetic without really saying anything of substance. They rely on well-worn sounds instead of coming up with new ideas. Altogether, these habits create a kind of political conversation that drifts far away from the real world. People get all worked up over words, rarely stopping to check if these words actually reflect any sort of reality. They form strong opinions on abstract ideas without grasping how these ideas play into their own lives. They become fluent in political jargon that actually keeps them from expressing their real-life experiences clearly. And this is exactly what those in power are banking on. People who are wrapped up in confusion are much easier to steer than those who truly get what's happening to them. The only way to fight back against this kind of language corruption is to stay alert and take language seriously. Everyone should be accountable for the words they use and the ones they accept from others. If someone uses a sugar-coated term, ask for straightforward honesty. If someone talks in circles, push for clear, specific information. If someone tries to redefine a word you know well, remind them of its original meaning. If someone brings up an old stale metaphor, challenge them to express it in newer, fresher ways. It's a constant effort to defend your mind in this way, but it's crucial to keeping rational political discussions alive. Without this effort, true democracy is impossible. Part 4. In the latter part of his adult life, George Orwell found himself battling on two fronts. He stood firmly against all forms of totalitarianism, whether it came from fascist regimes or communist ones. Yet he was no fan of capitalism, which he saw as fundamentally unfair and doomed to fail in the long run. This left him advocating for a middle ground that puzzled many. He identified as a democratic socialist, but his take on socialism was distinct from what was common among socialist movements of his day. Orwell's version was rooted in freedom over control, decency instead of dogma, and human needs rather than lofty theories. Orwell's journey towards socialism wasn't from books, but from witnessing poverty and inequality firsthand. Living with the destitute in Paris and London opened his eyes to the needless suffering capitalism inflicted on countless people. His research in northern England unveiled how industrial capitalism reduced people to mere cogs in a machine. And his stint as a colonial policeman in Burma showed him how capitalism thrived on exploiting those less powerful. These insights weren't drawn from theoretical musings. They were based on his own experiences. But Orwell's brand of socialism differed greatly from the Marxist socialism prevalent among leftists of his time. He wasn't interested in the intricate theories of historical materialism or dialectical processes. Nor did he think socialism was destined to happen or that it would fix all of humanity's woes. He wasn't captivated by the idea of reshaping society based on radical notions of human nature. His socialism was straightforward and realistic. He envisioned a society where regular folks could enjoy decent lives without fearing poverty, exploitation, or oppression. For Orwell, socialism had to be democratic. Any system concentrating power in the hands of a few would inevitably corrupt and oppress. It made no difference whether those people labeled themselves as capitalists, fascists, or communists. Power corrupts universally. The only safeguard against this was ensuring that decisions affecting people's lives were made by those very people. This required true democracy, not the sham democracy peddled by totalitarian regimes. Orwell realized that democracy and socialism weren't just compatible, they were essential for one another. Real democracy couldn't exist under capitalism because economic inequality led directly to political inequality. The wealthy could buy influence, leaving the poor sidelined from genuine participation in political discourse. Meanwhile, socialism was unachievable without democracy because effective economic planning needed the consent and involvement of those affected. Trying to enforce socialism from the top down would only result in another form of tyranny. Democracy and socialism had to evolve together, or they wouldn't work at all. This understanding set Orwell apart from many socialist movements of his era, which were willing to accept temporary dictatorships to establish socialist economies. They thought short-term oppression was justifiable if it meant achieving lasting equality. Orwell outright rejected this reasoning, knowing that temporary dictatorships never stayed temporary. Once someone held absolute power, they often found excuses to keep it indefinitely. The method determines the outcome, not the opposite. An authoritarian path to a socialist society would result in an authoritarian state, regardless of its economic structure. Orwell believed his democratic socialism also had to be inherently English. He wasn't a proponent of applying abstract universal principles uniformly across the globe. Political systems needed to emerge from specific cultures and traditions. English socialism had to honor English values like fair play, personal privacy, and gradual change. It couldn't just mimic Russian, German, or any other foreign models. It needed to be tailored to fit English conditions and character. This didn't mean English socialism was better than other types. It simply meant political systems should be aligned with the people they are meant to serve. Imagine trying to figure out what democratic socialism would actually be like in real life. Orwell didn't lay out a step-by-step plan, but he did toss around some basic ideas. He thought major industries should be owned by the public and run so that everyone benefits, not just a few folks looking to make a buck. Decisions about what gets made and who gets what wouldn't just be left to the bosses or big wigs. They'd involve the people who work there and those who use the products. While wealth wouldn't be split absolutely equally, it'd be shared much more fairly than it is under capitalism. Orwell saw political freedoms growing rather than getting clamped down on. Education would be open to all, regardless of their family ties. His vision was about building a society where everyone could chase their dreams and pitch in for the greater good. This didn't require the kind of revolution that involves storming barricades. Instead, Orwell dreamed of a peaceful, democratic shift that held on to the best parts of British culture while ditching its biggest wrongs. The change wouldn't be about violence. Small property owners would still have their rights, and the freedoms of individuals would be safe throughout. Not just politics and economics would shift. It was about people changing how they thought about each other. People would need to learn how to care for and look out for each other, breaking away from the self-interest that capitalism pushes. Orwell knew this change wouldn't be easy or guaranteed to work out better than capitalism or avoid the mistakes seen in other socialist tryouts. Nonetheless, he thought it was worth a shot because the alternatives, such as soaring inequality and chaos from capitalism, or the horror and control of fascism and communism, were much worse. Democratic socialism seemed to be the only way to ensure a society could be rich and free. Even if it didn't work out, trying and failing would be better morally than just settling for wrongs or giving in to oppression. For Orwell, it wasn't a matter of finding perfect answers. It was about choosing between hope and hopelessness. Part 5. The Unyielding Nature of Power. George Orwell saw something about power that many political thinkers like to brush under the rug. Power isn't just some tool that can be used for good or evil depending on who's holding it. It's a force that fundamentally changes anyone it touches. Power makes its own rules, develops its own needs, and crafts its own excuses. Even if someone starts out with the best intentions, that power will start to twist their character and goals over time. That's why revolutions often end up ditching the ideals they were founded on. Orwell learned this truth the hard way during the Spanish Civil War. He went to Spain thinking he was fighting for socialism, democracy, and human rights. But what he actually found was a confusing mess of groups all claiming to truly represent the people. The Communist Party, which was the biggest player among the leftists, spent as much time battling other socialists as they did fighting the fascists. They arrested, tortured, and killed folks who had been their buddies not long before. They defended these actions by saying unity was crucial for winning. But Orwell saw that it was something deeper. The Communist Party wasn't just making bad calls or acting under pressure. They were caught up in the natural momentum of power. Once they got a firm grip among the left, they had to squash any threats to their dominance. Other socialist groups became threats just because they existed independently. Their different views on strategy and tactics were seen as signs of treason or counter-revolutionary thought. The party couldn't allow any authority except their own. This wasn't just a move by sinister people. It was the structural reality of holding power in a fierce environment. Any group not getting rid of its rivals would eventually be taken down by them. This realization colored all of Orwell's political writing from then on. He came to see that political systems aren't just neutral tools for carrying out policies. They are dynamic forces that create their own must-dos and incentives. Democratic systems encourage some behaviors while shutting down others. Authoritarian systems lead folks in other directions entirely. But systems that put power into the hands of a select few will end up generally the same, regardless of what ideology or personalities are in play. Take a closer look at how it plays out. When a small group takes control over a society, they quickly bump into several practical challenges. They need to hold on to their power amid possible rivals. They need to pull resources from the populace to bankroll their operations. They must sideline organized resistance from forming, and they need to maintain the loyalty of their followers and underlings. Each of these issues steers them towards similar fixes, regardless of their initial plans. They set up secret police to sniff out potential dangers. They build propaganda machines to shape minds and views. They create a network of informants to keep tabs on people. They resort to scare tactics and force to silence dissent. They dole out rewards and punishments to keep their own people in line. None of these steps might have been on their original agenda. The revolutionaries who toppled the Russian Tsar didn't likely mean to create something worse than what was there before. But with every step in tightening their power, the next step becomes inescapable. Once you have secret police, you need to find targets to justify their presence. Once you identify enemies, you must treat them like enemies. Once violence starts, stopping could make you seem weak. The chain reaction of power kicks in and propels the system forward, regardless of anyone's intentions. The ones in charge end up trapped by the machines they've built. Orwell saw this pattern in every oppressive system he examined. The Nazis didn't start with genocide on their minds, but the twisted logic of their racial ideology inevitably led them down that dark path. At first, the Soviet communists didn't set out with the intention to starve millions of peasants. Their focus was more on achieving rapid industrial growth, and if that led to widespread hunger, it became a cost they were willing to accept. This system they created led them down a path where leaders felt pressured to take more and more extreme steps. The options always seemed to boil down to either showing weakness, compromising, or betraying the cause. The only actions viewed as truly committed to the revolution were the most merciless ones. That's why Orwell stressed the importance of dividing and limiting power, rather than just giving it to supposedly moral individuals. Even the best people can turn bad when they get too much power. To stop this change, power must be checked. No single person or group should gain enough control to dominate everyone. This doesn't just require teaching people to be good, but setting up systems that automatically create checks and balances, no matter who is in charge. Transparency, accountability, and regular chances for ordinary folks to replace those in charge are crucial. Orwell also realized that these safety measures are pretty vulnerable. People with power often have strong reasons to dodge or scrap these limits. They'll argue that urgent situations demand special actions. They'll claim that their rivals aren't playing fair, so they don't deserve protection. They'll say that being efficient means centralizing power, and discussions only lead to gridlock. Each of these arguments might make sense on its own, but together they pave the way to authoritarianism. The real way to fight this trend is for regular people to be constantly watchful. Folks need to be ready to defend these institutional safeguards, even if it seems like they're stopping good policies from happening. They should think twice before giving special powers to leaders they trust. They must demand transparency and accountability, even if keeping things secret seems easier. And above all, they should always remember that power can corrupt even those with the best intentions. The cost of freedom? Always being watchful, not just against threats from the outside, but also against the natural tendency of power to twist those who hold it. Part 6. George Orwell made a really crucial point about politics in the 20th century by pointing out the difference between patriotism and nationalism. A lot of folks mix these two up, using them like they mean the same thing, but Orwell got that they're actually about entirely different connections to your country and those living in it with you. Being patriotic is all about love and serving others, while nationalism stems from feeling insecure and tends to result in hostility. Grasping this distinction is super important for anyone trying to get involved in politics constructively. It's probably one of the biggest insights Orwell brings to our modern political climate. So here's how Orwell laid out patriotism. It's about being devoted to a specific place and way of life. Patriots love their nation because they know it really well. They cherish its scenery, culture, accomplishments, and character. They're aware of the country's shortcomings, but also see room for growth. Their affection is tangible and specific, not some abstract idea or belief. Patriots aim to make their country the best version of itself, not necessarily to outshine every other nation worldwide. This love is about defense, not attack. They want to safeguard their country's valuable traditions and institutions without any urge to impose their lifestyle on others. They get that other nations have their own practices that suit them. Their patriotism makes them a better neighbor, rather than a threat. They can admire and respect other cultures without feeling like their own is under attack. Nationalism, on the other hand, works differently. It's less about fondness for the country and more about believing your country is superior to others. The nationalist mindset is competitive rather than understanding. They need their country to be the best in every respect, or their identity feels at risk. Achievements at home only count if they prove dominance over rivals. This way of thinking skews their grasp of reality. They can't acknowledge any faults or setbacks in their country because that would shake their feeling of superiority. Similarly, they can't acknowledge any good in other countries because that might compromise their own country's claims of being the best. In this view, facts are just ammunition in a propaganda battle, not tools for crafting better policies. Nationalists end up with warped judgment, unable to make the straightforward evaluations crucial for political advancement. Orwell noticed that nationalism often zeroes in on symbols rather than real issues. Nationalists are heavily invested in things like flag displays, anthem etiquette, and elaborate rituals. They might get furious if these symbols aren't shown proper respect, but might not care at all whether their country's policies actually benefit its people. It's like putting on a show of respect matters more than making sure things are running smoothly. This obsession with appearances lets politicians steer nationalists away from policy failures by just stirring their emotions with pomp and ceremony. There's also what Orwell called transferred nationalism. Some intellectuals can't keep up a strong emotional tie to their own countries because they're too aware of their flaws and contradictions. But they still crave the satisfaction of backing a powerful cause. So they shift those nationalist feelings to foreign countries or big ideas that seem cleaner and more grand than their own societies. You'd see folks in the West who were into communism idolize Stalin's Soviet Union. Conservative thinkers might beam over some imagined past civilization. In both cases, being far away made it easy to idealize because they didn't have to deal with the uncomfortable truth. These transferred nationalists could keep believing because they never had to live with the reality of the systems they admired. Orwell also described negative nationalism as being mostly defined by hating some other group instead of loving your own. Anti-Semitism is a kind of negative nationalism that lacks any positive vision for society, similar to how some European thinkers use anti-American sentiment. These types of nationalism offer emotional comfort without demanding a constructive approach or a realistic look at alternatives. They let people feel morally superior without having to take responsibility for making real improvements. Instead of channeling frustration and resentment into useful action, they direct it toward hatred. The psychological draw of nationalism is quite clear. It gives a sense of identity and belonging that many folks are seeking. It presents simple solutions to confusing questions about political allegiance and moral duties. It sets clear lines between allies and adversaries in a complicated world. It allows regular individuals to experience a part of major historical events and accomplishments. For many, nationalism fills the spiritual gap left as traditional forms of religion decline. However, Orwell argued that the costs of these psychological benefits are just too steep. Nationalism makes rational political conversations nearly impossible because nationalists avoid acknowledging facts that challenge their emotional commitments. It results in policies driven by prestige and rivalry instead of addressing real human needs. It breeds international conflicts that exist solely to satisfy the psychological desires of nationalists rather than serving any real purpose. Perhaps most dangerously, it makes individuals willing to give up their freedom and well-being for vague goals like national glory or ideological purity. A nationalist loses their personal identity in favor of the collective identity of their chosen group. Orwell suggested that patriotism is a much healthier option than nationalism. A patriot maintains their personal judgment while sincerely caring about their community. They can cherish their country without the need to despise others. They can strive for improvement while acknowledging the existing issues. They can honor their traditions without being trapped by them. Their love is mature and realistic, not naive and idealized. Understanding this difference between patriotism and nationalism is particularly crucial in democratic societies. Democracy needs citizens who can think independently, yet still care enough about their communities to get involved in public matters. Patriots make good democratic citizens by blending emotional ties with logical reasoning. Nationalists, on the other hand, pose a risk to democracy since their emotional connections often trump their logical thinking. A democracy filled with nationalists risks losing its democratic nature and can turn into a system where various groups compete to enforce their beliefs on everyone else. Part 7. Class, Status, and Human Dignity. George Orwell grasped the concept of class in a remarkable way that most political thinkers haven't. He didn't see class as some abstract social category or mere economic relationship. For Orwell, it was all tied to human dignity. It was about the everyday humiliations and little cruelties that some folks inflict on others just because they can. It was about the mental toll inequality takes on both those oppressing and those being oppressed. Most crucially, it was about the barriers that stop people from connecting with one another on equal footing. Rather than relying on textbooks, Orwell gained his understanding of class through firsthand experience. He was born into what he labeled the lower upper middle class, an awkward spot in England's social structure. His family carried social ambitions but didn't have the financial means to back them up. They looked down on those beneath them, yet they were the subject of disdain from those above. This gave Orwell a unique insight into how class consciousness works at every societal level, shaping how people view themselves and others. Orwell's real crash course on class came when he purposefully stepped down the social hierarchy. After leaving his job with the Imperial Police in Burma, he spent months living amongst the poorest in Paris and London. He worked as a dishwasher in fancy restaurants, witnessing well-off patrons treating staff like mere servants rather than fellow humans. He slept in shelters for the homeless, noticing the complex rules and hierarchies that emerge even among those with nothing. He realized that class differences extend beyond finances. They touch on deep-rooted beliefs about human value and dignity. What startled Orwell most was how deeply the class system warped everyone's personality involved in it. Those from the working class developed habits of submission and deference, hindering their ability to effectively advocate for themselves. They started believing they belonged in their lower positions because they were somehow less capable or worthy than their betters. This psychological harm was often more damaging than their lack of material wealth. It stopped them from seeing that their circumstances were unfair and possible to change, making them unintentional participants in their own oppression. But upper classes suffered in their own way. They developed an air of entitlement and arrogance, dulling their sensitivity to others' suffering. They deceived themselves into thinking their privileges were earned, not inherited. They crafted intricate defenses of inequality, letting them feel righteous while perpetuating injustice. Most dangerously, they lost the ability to form genuine relationships across class boundaries. They couldn't see working-class individuals as unique people with their own thoughts, emotions, and dreams. Orwell witnessed these dynamics vividly during his exploration of working-class life in northern England. He was profoundly impressed by the dignity and intelligence of the coal miners and factory workers he met. They had a clear understanding of their plight and crafted sophisticated strategies to endure tough times. Yet they also learned to hide their true thoughts and feelings from middle-class observers like Orwell himself. Expressing anger or resentment about their treatment would only be seen as proof of their unsuitability for better positions, so they feigned gratitude and contentment even when they felt none. Meanwhile, the middle class developed what Orwell termed a remarkable knack for overlooking what's right in front of them. They could whiz through industrial areas without noticing the poverty and pollution. They could employ domestic help without a thought to the conditions those workers returned to after hours. They could back imperial actions without pondering the human costs involved. This selective blindness wasn't just selfishness. It was a mental strategy that let them preserve their self-image as good people while participating in a bad system. Orwell recognized that maintaining class distinctions involves numerous small rituals and assumptions, more than official rules or laws. When people walk around, chat, have their meals, and interact, it's pretty clear to others where they fit in the social ladder. These habits and signals are picked up at such a young age and practiced so much that they become second nature. Folks from different social backgrounds, even if they're in the same room, live in totally different worlds. They've got their own language, their own ideas about what's proper, and their own sense of how they should be treated by others. These differences can make true communication across social classes pretty tricky. But Orwell found out that under certain situations, the walls between classes could come down, even if just for a little while. When he was in the thick of the Spanish Civil War, he experienced short periods where it felt like everyone was on the same level, no matter where they came from. With the same dangers and tough times facing everyone, things like social status just didn't matter anymore. People connected as individuals instead of walking stereotypes of their social classes. This made Orwell believe that class differences weren't something natural. They were man-made, and they could be erased if the root causes were addressed. That's why Orwell's version of socialism focused on how humans interacted, not just the financial or ownership side of things. He dreamed of a world where what someone did for a living or where they came from didn't stop them from being seen as equals. This was about more than just swapping around money or changing who owned what. It involved shaking up the long-standing class culture and mindset. Folks had to learn to see themselves and others differently. They'd need to practice recognizing and respecting each other genuinely. Orwell understood this shift wouldn't be quick or easy. Class awareness runs deep, woven into language, learning, family customs, and community. Just saying everyone's equal wouldn't magically undo the deep-seated attitudes born from generations of unequal treatment. Real change demanded clear, active steps to build new systems and ways of interacting that encouraged equality. It also meant keeping an eye out for any new types of hierarchy or status that might try to take root. The aim wasn't to wipe out every difference between people, but to make sure those differences didn't mean some people were valued less than others. In Part 8, The Individual Against the Collective, George Orwell's deep insights about the tug-of-war between a person's mind and the power of the masses shine through. For Orwell, the real fight for human liberty doesn't play out in governments or on battlefields. Instead, it happens in those few tiny spaces inside our heads. This is where each of us decides if we're going to think for ourselves or let outside forces dictate our thoughts. Everything else hinges on who wins this mental struggle. Orwell arrived at this stance after some rough first-hand encounters with group movements. He jumped into the fray against fascists in Spain, thinking banding together was key to saving individual freedoms. But what he found was that even well-meaning collective efforts often smothered personal judgment for the sake of team loyalty. Followers end up taking the party's version of the truth instead of piecing together their own perspective. Raising doubts makes you a traitor or a rebel. Slowly, people forget how to think independently. This isn't always a top-down order from cunning leaders. Sometimes it's the natural flow of being in a group. People crave belonging. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves, something significant. The emotional high from sharing goals and beliefs with others who get them is irresistible. But this feel-good union comes at the price of losing intellectual autonomy. The deeper people dive into group identity, the tougher it gets to face facts that might not paint their group in the best light. Orwell noticed these patterns across every political group he came across. Conservatives ignored capitalism's missteps or imperialism's wrongs. Socialists turned a blind eye to Stalin's horrors or gaps in Marxist thought. Even pacifists didn't see that their peace stance relied on others who'd use force for them. Each group built complex mental walls to block out info that challenged their core beliefs. They stopped learning from life because they couldn't admit when reality clashed with their convictions. Orwell coined a term for the worst of this: doublethink. That's when someone can hold two clashing ideas at the same time without seeing the clash. In his book 1984, a party member might think Big Brother is all-powerful and yet always under threat. They believe the party never errs, while also thinking it constantly fixes past blunders. Such contradictions don't bother them, because their beliefs show up only when useful and disappear when inconvenient. The brain gets divided into separate areas that never talk to each other. But according to Orwell, doublethink isn't just a totalitarian regime issue. It sneaks into all societies where what people want mentally doesn't match up with real life. Politicians in democracies make promises they know they can't keep because voters want to believe them. Shoppers pick up stuff they don't actually need, swayed by ads creating fake needs. People back policies that go against their own good just to satisfy the need to feel superior to others. In these cases, People opt for comforting lies over harsh truths. The fix for doublethink, Orwell suggested, is what he called common sense. It's not about deep philosophy or scientific breakdowns. It's the straightforward skill of seeing things as they really are and remembering what you see. Common sense tells you stones are hard, water is wet, and when you let something go, it falls. It says two opposing statements can't both be right. It tells you your own experiences trump official spin. The key takeaway here is that no matter what anyone else might say, 2 plus 2 will always be 4. These basic facts lay down a foundation that can't be altered by fancy reasoning. However, in a world teeming with folks eager to sway your thinking, sticking to common sense demands ongoing effort. You've got to trust what you see, even if it doesn't match up with what everyone else believes. Be open to changing your mind if new information challenges your earlier views. Also, it's crucial to admit when you don't know something, rather than faking understanding. Most importantly, the goal is to think independently rather than just swallowing what others tell you. This form of intellectual freedom can be lonely and tough, but it's the best shield against being manipulated. Orwell realized that maintaining this kind of mental freedom wasn't something most people could or would do. Many folks find comfort and safety in groups that dictate their thoughts, preferring the shared wrongness over being right on their own. But Orwell had faith that even a small number of independent thinkers could make a big impact. They could stand as witnesses to reality when most are swept up in group delusions. They could keep alive the memory of facts others wanted to ignore. They could uphold truth and reason standards essential for meaningful conversations about politics. Even in the bleakest times, they could keep the hope alive that things might change. This is why Orwell stressed that individuals must resist the pressure to conform. Good political systems alone aren't enough if the people in them lack the guts and independence to use them well. Democracy relies on citizens who critically evaluate their options. Science thrives on researchers following the evidence wherever it goes. Journalism counts on reporters to tell the truth, even if it's not popular. In every field, progress happens because individuals stand up to the crowd when it's in the wrong. Yet Orwell acknowledged that standing alone has its limits. No one is completely free from the influence of the society they're part of. Our thinking is molded by our culture, education, and social ties. The aim isn't to be perfectly objective, but to have enough independence to think clearly. This means striking a balance between being part of society and thinking for yourself. It's about joining in with others without losing your personal judgment. This balance is tough to find and easy to slip from, but it's crucial for any society aiming to stay both open and functional. Part 9. George Orwell got his grasp on the nitty-gritty of imperialism through 5 years as a colonial cop in Burma. This stint gave him a first-hand look at how empires truly function at ground level, affecting both the oppressed and the oppressors. He saw imperialism as a corrupting force, leaving psychological scars that stick around for ages. Above all, he figured out that imperialism isn't just about cash or military tactics. It's driven by a human urge to feel superior to others. Orwell landed in Burma as a 19-year-old, loaded with the usual ideas about the British Empire's civilizing mission. He thought British rule was all about bringing order, advancement, and enlightenment to folks who couldn't run their own show. Instead, what he found was a scenario built on fear, resentment, and misunderstanding. The British kept their grip through force and the looming threat of more force. The Burmese went along because they had no other choice. But they despised their rulers and longed for the day they could boot them out. There was zero gratitude, no willing teamwork, and no real movement toward any ideal of civilization. What really shook Orwell was how this system affected the British officials running the show. They had to act like they were in command, even when they were insecure and unsure. They had to make calls about cultures they didn't get, for people whose languages they didn't speak. They had to uphold laws that often made no sense locally. They had to fake a confidence and wisdom they didn't have. Over time, this need to always project authority messed up their ability to honestly look at themselves. Orwell summed up this twisted psychology in his well-known essay, Shooting an Elephant. As a police officer, he was once called to handle an elephant that had gone wild and killed someone. By the time he showed up, the elephant had calmed down and wasn't a danger anymore. The smart move would have been to wait for its owner to reclaim it. But a crowd gathered, eager to see what the white man would do. They expected him to shoot the elephant because that's what a strong imperial officer would supposedly do. Even though Orwell knew that pulling the trigger was pointless and wasteful, he also knew that backing down would make him look weak. His authority was tied to always appearing confident and decisive, so he shot the elephant. Not because it was right, but because the rules of imperialism demanded it. In that moment, he realized he'd become trapped in a role that forced his hand. The system that gave him control over others stripped him of control over himself. Orwell's experience showed him that imperialism shackles both oppressor and oppressed. Imperial officials couldn't allow themselves to seem unsure, kind, or respectful of other cultures because it would weaken the psychological ground they stood on. They had to constantly project superiority, even when they knew they were outmatched in knowledge or moral standing. This act became a mental burden, skewing their personalities and tainting their connections with those around them. Orwell also noticed how imperialism warped the minds of the colonized. Some started believing that British rule was better than their age-old ways. They picked up British habits and values while looking down on their own roots. This mental colonization often wreaked more havoc than the political or economic kinds, creating deep divides between those who sided with the empire and those who fought against it. These rifts often lingered, even after countries gained formal independence. But Orwell didn't see imperialism as just a relic of past European colonies. He saw it as a mindset that could rise again anywhere people seek dominance over others. In any situation where one group thinks they're naturally better than another, you'll find similar patterns of behavior. The way upper-class folks in England treated those from the working class was a lot like how white colonizers acted towards the people they colonized. The same mindset of believing in a natural pecking order, showing off their superiority, and the bubbling resentment on both sides were evident in class relationships right at home. This realization helped shape Orwell's thoughts on totalitarian regimes like fascism and communism. These movements offered to stamp out old-school oppression, but they ended up creating brand new, intense forms of control. Nazi Germany aimed to build a racial empire that would treat Slavic folks the same way European powers had historically treated people in Africa and Asia. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union built an empire of ideas, subjugating other nations, all in the name of socialist solidarity. In every case, the talk about freedom masked what was just another version of the imperial mindset. Those in charge fooled themselves into thinking their rule was for the good of the people they were oppressing. Orwell thought the only way to stop this vicious cycle was to ditch the superiority complex that fuels all kinds of imperialism. That meant realizing no group has a natural claim to boss around another. It meant seeing that cultural differences don't automatically mean one culture is above another. And it meant believing that political and economic systems should work to meet the needs of the people living under them, rather than just serving those in charge. But Orwell also understood that shaking off this imperial mindset would be tough, because the urge to feel superior seems to run deep in human nature. Those who've been oppressed often end up dreaming not of putting an end to oppression, but of becoming the oppressors themselves. Revolutionary movements that start out fighting against imperial rule can often wind up creating new kinds of imperial rule. The cycle rolls on because the root psychology doesn't change. It's only by getting to grips with this mindset and making a conscious effort to overcome it that societies can hope to build real equality between different groups of people. Part 10. Intellectuals and their moral failures. George Orwell had a bit of a love-hate thing going with intellectuals. He was one of them, no doubt, but spent loads of time calling them out for being dishonest, full of themselves, and out of touch with regular folks. Orwell thought people with sharp minds had a big role to play because they shaped public thoughts and were clued into info that others weren't. If they dropped the ball, it wasn't just a personal oops. It messed with the very heart of sensible public chats and left democracies clueless when it came to important choices. What really got Orwell's goat was how intellectuals often chose fancy ideas over real-world facts. They'd back some grand theory, even when it clearly hurt people, shoving aside or twisting facts that didn't fit their beliefs. They'd use their smarts to build up fancy arguments for things they felt rather than thought out. In doing this, they stopped being truth seekers and turned into cheerleaders for whatever idea had them hooked. Orwell saw this most clearly when it came to Soviet communism. Back in the 1930s and 40s, a bunch of Western thinkers stood by Stalin's side no matter the overwhelming proof of his cruel and shady deeds. They might say mass killings were steps needed for socialism or paint the show trials as fair crackdowns. Any whispers about forced labor camps were brushed off as capitalist lies. It wasn't that they didn't know better. It was just that admitting the ugly truth would have shattered their dreamy view of a socialist revolution. These brainy folks swapped out their loyalty from their own nations to the Soviet dream, needing to believe that somewhere a fair society was happening. This emotional tug blinded them to the actual horrors of Soviet strategies. They saw what fit their rosy picture and tuned out the rest. Even when Soviet wrongdoings stared them in the face, they chalked them up to temporary glitches or necessary evils. They just couldn't accept that their ideal society was another version of dictatorship. But Orwell wasn't throwing shade only at the lefty intellectuals. Those on the conservative side did the same jig when justifying capitalism, stay the same social orders, or running empires. They'd downplay or skip over the harm these systems did while overplaying the perks. Armed with clever economic or philosophical chatter, they'd defend setups that mainly padded their own pockets. Anyone who spoke up was dismissed as a pie-in-the-sky dreamer who didn't grasp the tricky nature of running the world. In every instance, their sharp thinking was used to dodge making straight-up moral calls. Orwell thought this intellectual decay had a few roots. To start, brainy types often relied financially on places with a vested interest in keeping things just as they were. Universities, think tanks, newspapers, and publishers often had rich backers or corporate sponsors demanding that scholars back the bigger agendas of their political and economic game. Stepping too far out of line meant getting the boot from mainstream places. Plus, brainiacs often hung out in circles that shielded them from seeing the impact of the ideas they pushed. They could wave the flag for extreme financial shakeups as they wouldn't have to suffer through the aftermath. They might back imperial conquest without ever having to face the folks being colonized. Waging wars was fine from their desks since they wouldn't be on the front lines. Living in such bubbles made it too easy to see real human suffering as a mere side note in their fixation on grand ideals. They lost sight of the everyday reality tangled up in their grand political plans. So according to Orwell, brainy folks tended to get sucked into what he called power worship. They were drawn to movements and leaders who seemed like they were really making waves in history rather than just reacting to it. They had this urge to be on the winning side of big historical changes. This inclination made them more likely to overlook the shady tactics used by powerful figures as long as these figures appeared to be on the right track. They started mixing up significant historical actions with moral righteousness. What they forgot was that the events making the biggest historical impact are often the ones wreaking the most moral havoc. Orwell thought intellectuals could only properly do their jobs if they stayed committed to intellectual honesty, no matter what political fallout might come from that. This involved recognizing truths that clashed with their own views and being ready to call out the movements and leaders they had once supported when they took a wrong turn. It required the courage to stand apart from the crowd when needed. Above all else, they had to remember that their first duty was to the truth, more than to any political agenda or social group. Truth had to come first, way ahead of success, staying consistent or fitting in. Meeting this tough standard of honesty was no walk in the park. It demanded constant soul-searching and the humility to admit when they were wrong. It required them to withstand the mental pressure to conform and become loyal followers of the group. It meant accepting that thinking independently might sometimes leave them feeling lonely and cut off. Not many intellectuals could live up to this demanding code all the time, but Orwell thought even those who often fell short still played a vital role by sometimes speaking out on truths others were too scared to voice. He also believed intellectuals had a duty to write about political matters with clarity and honesty. Thanks to their education and knack for words, they had unique power to shape the public's views. If they muddled things instead of making them clear, they contributed to the breakdown of helpful public discussions. If they used their influence to look out for themselves instead of the public, they'd be letting down the trust society had put in them. Orwell believed that an intellectual who intentionally muddles critical truths is more of a threat than someone who simply doesn't know any better. Once you know something, you're responsible for using that knowledge wisely. Part 11. George Orwell had this idea that all literature is tied to politics, just not in the way most folks tend to think. He didn't see good books as tools to push specific candidates or agendas. What he meant was that literature plays a big role in shaping how people think about the core issues of life. It shapes what we see as possible, what we desire, and what we think is right or wrong. So, in deeper ways, every serious piece of literature is political, whether it's reinforcing or questioning the beliefs behind political systems. Even if writers claim they're just focusing on art, they can't shrug off their political responsibilities. But Orwell made it clear that for literature to do its job politically, it still needed to be real literature. If art gets turned into propaganda, it's pretty much useless because it messes up both politics and art without doing justice to either. Quality political writing had to first and foremost be good writing. It needed to have believable characters, gripping stories, and resolutions that hit home. People needed to be pulled into a story by its artistic value before they could tap into its political layers. If art dumped its style for a political message, it wouldn't connect with anyone who didn't already share that viewpoint. This idea guided how Orwell wrote his own political works. Take Animal Farm, for example. It's powerful as a political tale because it starts off as a simple story about farm animals. People get hooked by the animals' storylines before they catch on to what those animals stand for politically. By the time folks spot the political side of it, the story's message about revolutionary corruption has already sunk in. The political message just flows naturally from how the book is put together. This blend of story and meaning is what makes it both a piece of great literature and a solid political message. Orwell didn't change that approach with 1984 either. That novel chills us about politics because it fascinates us first with Winston Smith's personal fight to retain his humanity in a harsh world. People relate to Winston's quest for truth, love, and self-respect. His crushing defeat feels like our own tragedy, not just some dry political debate. The terror of totalitarianism hits hard because it's shown through human lives, not just explained through theories. The political punch packs more power because it's delivered through the artistry of the story. Yet Orwell knew different stories served different political messages better. A satire like Animal Farm could highlight the gap between what politics promised and what really happened. Books like 1984 predicted where political trends might take us. Nonfiction like The Road to Wigan Pier turned abstract social issues into real stories. Essays like Politics in the English Language picked apart how language could be manipulated for control. Each type had its own pros and cons for making political points. Orwell figured literature had a duty to hold on to human values, especially during political turmoil. When ideologies demanded all focus be on political aims, stories showed individual human experiences that politics aimed to support. When propaganda painted everything as just black and white, literature looked into the messy realities that made life worth exploring. When political talk became empty and twisted, good writing demonstrated truth and clarity. This role of literature became crucial when totalitarian regimes emerged in the 20th century, trying to turn every aspect of life, even thoughts and dreams, into a matter of political concern. Literature has always been a safe haven where personal experiences could thrive, away from the prying eyes of oppressive regimes. It helped keep alive the essence of a world where people could love, think, and feel freely, without someone always watching over their shoulder. During the harshest political times, literature held on to humanity's core values that might have faded away otherwise. But Orwell cautioned people not to confuse literature for activism. Some thinkers took shelter in admiring art to dodge the uncomfortable truth of political life. They tricked themselves into believing that keeping cultural values intact was more crucial than standing up to political tyranny. This was a way of avoiding reality, ultimately aiding those who were happy with things as they were. While literature could aid in standing up to political wrongdoing, it couldn't replace the real fight. Both writers and readers needed to play their part as members of society to protect the very freedom that allows good literature to exist. Orwell also pointed out that literature could be twisted for harmful political goals. Dictatorial powers created their own artistic works to praise the regime and vilify their opponents. These works were often skillfully crafted and could stir emotions deeply, yet they narrowly clamped down on human insight rather than broaden it. They pushed people to blindly follow collective power instead of trusting their own judgment. They fed hate, fear, and blind devotion over love, bravery, and free thought. Good literature needed to counter these trends by upholding the very values that authoritarian art aimed to squash. Thus, literature's role wasn't just about upliftment, but also about opposition. On the positive side, literature should delve into and honor the vast spectrum of human experience. It should guide readers to a deeper understanding of themselves and others, broadening their empathy, imagination, and moral insight. On the flip side, literature should fight off the urge to boil down the human experience into mere political rhetoric. It should challenge propaganda, unveil falsehoods, and safeguard the purity of language. It should consistently remind us that individual people outweigh any political power meant to manage them. In fulfilling these roles, literature emerges as a vital form of political engagement available to free societies. Part 12. George Orwell didn't criticize capitalism from a theoretical standpoint. He spoke from real-life experiences, observing firsthand how capitalist structures impacted people. When he was a colonial policeman in Burma, he saw how capitalism took advantage of both the land and the workforce in territories under colonial rule. Later, as he looked into the lives of the working class in northern England, he got a close-up view of the harsh realities everyday workers faced under industrial capitalism. Orwell himself experienced poverty in Paris and London, gaining insight into how unforgiving market systems were to those without assets, except their labor. In each role, he saw capitalism as a setup that put profit above people's well-being. Orwell was particularly struck by what he saw as the irrational nature of capitalism. He observed how this system could result in a paradox of abundance and scarcity happening at the same time. Factories churned out more products than people could afford, leaving the workers who produced them without essentials. While some land sat unused, homelessness was rampant. Food was destroyed to keep prices up amidst widespread hunger. This wasn't a fluke. It was capitalism's built-in outcome. With profit as the central goal, people's needs were overshadowed by market demands. Capitalism served the accumulation of wealth, not human interests. In addition, Orwell recognized how capitalism twisted human interactions. Under this system, almost everything, including labor and land, was seen as a commodity that could be traded. Over time, even interpersonal relationships were measured in terms of economic worth. Success revolved around wealth accumulation, not on one's contribution to societal well-being. This reduction of human life to mere transactions caused deep psychological harm beyond just material shortages. The way capitalism entrenched a class division was deeply troubling for Orwell. He noticed how it separated people into strict hierarchies based on capital ownership rather than personal merit. Those with capital could live leisurely, while those who only had their labor had to sell it to survive. This split led to starkly different life experiences and psychological responses to the world. Capital owners often felt entitled and dominant, whereas workers tended to be submissive. Yet Orwell's criticism of capitalism didn't ignore the fact that it brought forth real benefits. Capitalist societies generally enjoyed more wealth than those preceding them. They provided more pathways for personal advancement and better protected individual rights. They inspired innovation and efficiency, unlike other economic models. Crucially, capitalism laid down the production groundwork that made socialism look feasible rather than just an idealistic fantasy. Orwell also recognized that not all forms of capitalism were the same. Various capitalist nations handled the balance between private profit and public good differently. Some offered better social security, powerful labor unions, and more extensive public services. Others had democratic systems enabling workers to influence economic decisions. These differences indicated that capitalism could be adjusted and controlled rather than completely dismantled. The real challenge lay in whether these reforms could tackle the system's core issues or just soften its harshest blows. Ultimately, Orwell came to believe that capitalism's troubles weren't just random mishaps, but were embedded in its structure. As long as profit motives drove production, Human needs would always play second fiddle to market trends. As long as the divide between capital owners and labor sellers stood, class struggles would persist and potentially worsen. If the folks making economic calls are the ones lining their pockets and not the everyday people who bear the impact, then the regular folks won't ever have a say in their own financial destinies. Trying to patch this up with tweaks that keep capitalism's core untouched just won't cut it. What's needed is a complete overhaul of how we structure our economic connections. But Orwell wasn't looking to swap capitalism with the kind of state-controlled socialism they had in the Soviet Union. He thought of that as basically state capitalism, where the power just shifted from private owners to government officials, leaving workers without real power. So even if the faces at the top changed, the class hierarchy stayed put. True socialism, in Orwell's eyes, would need to be democratic. It would give the power of economic decision-making to the people directly impacted by those choices. It would spread power around instead of hoarding it in a single place. It would also need to strike a balance between individual liberties and shared ownership. Now, Orwell didn't lay down a step-by-step plan for putting this into practice. He cared more about setting up the core principles than nailing down all the little details. He figured that each society should craft its own version of socialism that fits its unique background and situation. The big deal was committing to shaping economic systems that serve human well-being, not just private gain. It was about guaranteeing that the people doing the work had a say in how it unfolded and why it happened. It was about creating a space where everyone could develop their abilities and pitch in for the community's benefit. Orwell still, he felt the effort was crucial because, frankly, the other options weren't any better. Capitalism was stirring up more and more inequality and uncertainty, shaking the ground beneath democratic society. Fascism and authoritarian communism were peddling fake fixes that only brought about tyranny and oppression. For Orwell, democratic socialism was the only road that offered a chance to be both flourishing and free. Part 13. George Orwell had a keen sense of how technology wasn't just a neutral tool, but something that could shift the power dynamics between individuals and big institutions. With every new tech development, there was a change in the balance. It could either boost personal freedoms or tighten control. The very tools that were supposed to free us from tedious work and loneliness could just as easily be turned into the most effective surveillance systems ever created. The real issue wasn't about whether or not we should invent new gadgets, but how to make sure they enhance our freedom instead of stripping it away. In his novel 1984, Orwell dives deep into this idea with the invention of the telescreen. This gadget doubled up as your regular entertainment hub and as a spy tool, feeding you news and fun stuff while snooping around your living room for any signs of rebellion or step-out-of-line behavior. What's worse, you couldn't just switch it off or get away from its constant vigil. Over time, having this eye on you becomes so routine that folks stop noticing it as an intrusion and instead welcome it as just another part of life. It's everywhere, so it practically becomes invisible. Back when Orwell penned 1984, this kind of all-seeing tech wasn't real. The gadgets needed weren't around, and making them would have cost a fortune. But Orwell got it. Tech keeps evolving, and prices drop. What once looked like pure sci-fi could be tomorrow's reality. He wasn't so much predicting the future gadgets as much as exploring what happens politically when such capabilities are in reach. He aimed to alert folks to the looming threats well before they became inescapable. He knew that both authoritarian regimes and democratic governments would find surveillance tech tempting. Authoritarian types would grab it to keep their grip on people and squash political dissent. Democracies might claim to use it for fighting crime, snuffing out terrorism, and making government work better. Whatever the reason, it'd all lead to the same end. Individual privacy would take a hit, and folks would find it harder to act freely. The sneaky part about this was how slow and steady the erosion was, according to Orwell. No dramatic overnight takeovers, just a slow creep, with every new spying power explained away as a logical answer to real problems. People would trade little bits of their privacy for a little more safety or convenience without noticing the big picture, until they realized the pile of freedom they'd given up. By then, the whole surveillance machine would be so locked in that tearing it out would feel like an impossible task. Orwell was especially worried about how all this watching would affect independent thought. When folks know they're being watched, they start acting in ways they think the watchers expect, even when they're on their own. Over time, this automatic self-censorship becomes second nature. Ideas that might rock the boat get shoved aside before you even get a chance to think them through. Rather than just a physical surveillance system, it turns into a mental way of keeping you in check. The endgame isn't about catching someone doing bad things. It's about making sure people don't even entertain the thought of stepping out of line. On the flip side, Orwell saw that technology could also be a force for good if we built it with the right intentions. Communication tech could bring people together, let them swap ideas and plan actions from miles apart. Information tech could open up access to knowledge that used to be hoarded by those in the know. With production tech, we'd need less human effort to cover basic needs, freeing up time for learning, being creative, and personal growth. The same tools that might lock us down in a surveillance state could just as well kick open the doors to unparalleled human growth and opportunities. So, the end result really hinges on the kind of political and economic environments that new technologies come up in. Orwell figured that because of this, keeping a democratic grip on how technology advances is super important. If it's mainly big companies chasing money or government bodies seeking control that are behind new tech, they'll probably make and use these technologies in ways that cater to their goals, not necessarily what's best for everyone. That's why in democracies, there should be systems in place that ensure tech development happens with public input and through democratic choices. For this to work, not only does the general populace need to be tech savvy, but also the political setups need to be ready to regulate tech effectively. It was clear to Orwell that pulling off this kind of democratic control over tech wouldn't be a walk in the park at all. Technology is advancing at a crazy speed, while democratic systems are set up for more deliberate and slower decision-making. Plus, new tech is so complex that the average Joe might find it hard to wrap his head around what's at stake, making it tough for him to weigh in on decisions about tech development. And since new technologies are developed worldwide, it's tough for any one democracy to keep a leash on how they're designed and used. These hurdles suggest that tech growth might outstrip democratic checks and balances, creating situations that democracies are then forced to just roll with. The chance to keep democratic control is slipping fast. Despite these challenges, Orwell was convinced that pushing for democratic oversight of tech is crucial to keeping human freedom intact. The other choice would be to let tech grow on its own terms, ignoring how it affects us. That scenario might lead to a world where humans serve machines, instead of tech serving us. Folks would basically become extensions of machines rather than the ones in charge. Our ability to think independently and act on our own might dwindle from lack of use, making us more efficient and predictable, but less human in any real sense. Orwell's central question about technology was whether people can stay in charge of what they create. Every tech advancement boosts what we can do, but also limits our freedoms. The trick is to enjoy the perks of tech growth while dodging the downsides of becoming reliant on it. This means keeping a close eye and actively directing tech development in line with our human values, rather than letting those evolve based on what technology demands. The importance of this effort is massive. The future of our freedom might very well hang on how we tackle this challenge. Part 14. War, Peace, and Endless Conflict. George Orwell had a unique way of grasping the concept of war, something most never fully understand. He had first-hand experience as a soldier during the Spanish Civil War, where he got shot in the throat and nearly lost his life. But beyond his personal ordeal, what stood out to him was how war operated politically and psychologically in modern societies. Orwell saw war not merely as a temporary failure of politics, but as an essential tool for political manipulation and control. In the 20th century, endless war became a method to organize society and shape how people thought. Peace, once the norm that war disrupted, turned into the strange condition that endless conflict aimed to prevent. This revelation forms the backbone of the world depicted in 1984. In Orwell's Oceania, they're in a constant state of war, always against either East Asia or Eurasia, but never both simultaneously. While the enemy's name might change from time to time, being at war remains a constant. The people are fed the narrative that these wars are crucial for their safety and that winning is just a step away. However, Orwell points out that these conflicts aren't meant to be won. Instead, they're designed to absorb the society's extra resources and uphold a perpetual emergency that makes authoritarian rule seem necessary. This ongoing warfare benefits the totalitarian regime in several ways. It justifies having a massive military and security force, which can also keep the local population in check. It creates a sense of outside peril that convinces people to sacrifice freedoms and accept harsh conditions. It focuses people's frustrations on foreign foes, diverting attention from homegrown issues. It also hinders international cooperation that might challenge the regime's hold on information and ideology. Most critically, it perpetuates a state of emergency that sidelines democratic governance. Orwell witnessed these tactics in action during the 1930s and 40s. Nazi Germany harnessed the fear of foreign threats to dismantle democratic structures and attack minorities at home. The Soviet Union exploited the idea of capitalist threats to justify extreme measures and aggressive industrial policies. Even democratic nations like Britain used wartime situations to expand government reach and curtail civil liberties. Often, what was supposed to be a temporary, emergency measure started to become a fixture in the political landscape. However, Orwell also noted that the mindset around war was shifting fundamentally. Traditional wars were between clear-cut nation-states aiming for specific resources or territories, and they wound down once those goals were met or costs soared too high. Modern ideological wars, however, fought for big ideas like democracy versus fascism or socialism versus capitalism, allowed no room for negotiation. The enemy's entire way of life had to be eradicated for victory. Peace became impossible through talks, as clashing beliefs could never coexist. In this ideological battle, old foes remained foes because their core values were worlds apart. The globe split into enduring camps perpetually braced for a final showdown that would decide humankind's destiny. No longer a goal, peace morphed into a perilous belief that threatened resolve. Orwell observed that continuous war shook up a society's internal workings. Nations in a constant state of war, or preparing for it, grew into militarized cultures where obedience, hierarchy, and collective sacrifice took precedence over individual liberties and self-fulfillment. Military attitudes and approaches seeped into civilian life, reshaping institutions far from the battlefield. Schools started looking more like military boot camps, factories turned into something like military squads, and political parties began to mirror military structures. Society as a whole got swept up into this war mentality, squeezing out all the usual peaceful activities that had been the hallmarks of civilized living. Art, literature, philosophy, and science took a back seat, all redirected to serve military needs. The economic toll of an ongoing war was just as devastating. Massive resources, which could have been used to improve human lives, were instead funneled into making weapons. These weapons, once used, would either obliterate lives or become outdated and need replacing. The brightest scientists and engineers got roped into military research rather than working on projects to help regular folks. Innovation shifted focus to creating better ways to destroy rather than better ways to produce. Even when abundance was possible, the war economy created false shortages. People were convinced to accept a drop in their living standards to support the ongoing war efforts. But maybe the most damaging impact of this never-ending war was on people's minds. When constantly threatened by violence, folks started to live in fear, suspicion, and aggression, poisoning their interactions. They began seeing the world as a black and white battle between good and evil, instead of complex issues needing careful thought. They lost the ability to empathize with anyone labeled as an enemy and couldn't engage in the kind of rational debate and compromise that democracies need. The war mindset made genuine democratic politics unworkable, even if democratic structures were still around. Orwell thought escaping this endless cycle of conflict would need a major shift in how people viewed politics and global relations. They'd have to ditch ideologies that divided the world into opposing camps. They would need to understand that different societies could organize themselves in various ways without being threats to each other. Developing international organizations for settling disputes through dialogue, not force, was crucial. But above all, they'd have to cherish peace and human welfare more than they did victory and national pride. This shift in consciousness would be a tougher challenge than any political or economic overhaul. Part 15. Spain, the catalyst for Orwell's political awakening. For George Orwell, the Spanish Civil War was a pivotal moment in his political journey. It changed him from someone who merely watched political happenings into an active participant in the fight between freedom and tyranny. This experience shaped his understanding of political movements, influencing all his future writings. In Spain, Orwell witnessed how lofty revolutionary ideals could be betrayed by those who claimed to fight for them. He saw firsthand the stark difference between political promises and the harsh reality, and realized how the fight against one type of tyranny could easily lay the groundwork for another. Orwell headed to Spain in December 1936 with fairly straightforward political beliefs. He saw fascism as evil and socialism as good. For him, the Spanish Republic symbolized democracy and progress, while Franco's forces represented backwardness and oppression. He expected to see a united left bravely standing up against the dark forces. Instead, he encountered a confusing mix of factions, each claiming to truly represent the Spanish people's interests. The left was so deeply divided, sometimes it seemed their internal conflicts were even more vicious than those with the right wing. Orwell joined the POUM, a modest Marxist group that opposed both fascism and Stalinism. They supported a workers' revolution, but rejected the Communist Party's desire for centralized control over the Republican cause. This stance put them at odds not just with Franco's fascists, but also with the Soviet-supported communists, who played a crucial role in aiding the Republic. Initially, Orwell viewed these internal disputes as annoying distractions from the main battle against fascism. He naively believed that people with similar overall goals could collaborate despite tactical differences, not realizing how deep those differences ran. Orwell's education on the reality of the situation was harsh and swift. He witnessed the Communist Party systematically dismantling other left-wing groups through arrests, staged trials, and assassinations. They wielded their access to Soviet weapons and supplies to enforce their political dominance within the Republican ranks. He observed firsthand how they manipulated reality, denying events he saw with his own eyes and creating false narratives. The most shocking revelation was that the communists seemed more interested in building their own power than in truly defeating fascism. They were even prepared to undermine the Republican effort if it meant strengthening their position. From this experience, Orwell gleaned several critical lessons that shaped his later political thoughts. Firstly, he realized that political movements are never as pure or united as their public image suggests. Every movement harbors internal factions with varying goals and methods. The faction that eventually takes charge might stray far from the movement's original ideals. People who join thinking they are fighting for one cause may find themselves serving a very different agenda. Noble intentions at the start don't guarantee noble outcomes. Secondly, Orwell learned that the methods used to reach political aims can profoundly affect those very aims. The Communist Party justified its authoritarian tactics by claiming unity was vital for defeating fascism. However, the strategies they used to create unity were no different from those employed by fascist groups. They relied on secret police, staged trials, propaganda, and terror to keep control. Adopting fascist tactics led to results that mirrored fascism, even though they claimed to oppose it. The means had warped the ends beyond recognition. Lastly, Orwell understood that political movements often draw individuals more focused on gaining power than on achieving the supposed goals of the movement. The communist leadership in Spain included those who seemed to relish eliminating opponents over defending the republic. They saw the revolutionary chaos as a chance for personal gain and advancing their careers. The lofty talk of worker liberation often masked nothing more than pure ambition and cruelty. Revolutions lured in saints and psychopaths alike, with the latter surprisingly skillful at seizing power. This wasn't by mere chance. It was a built-in aspect of these upheavals. Orwell saw firsthand how the press could be twisted to support false stories. Across Europe, newspapers echoed the communist side of the Spanish story without checking facts. Journalists who'd never set foot in Spain wrote as if they had front-row seats to the battles, confidently spinning tales about political shifts they didn't grasp. They parroted propaganda as though it were genuine news. Even more unsettling, some seemed aware they were spreading falsehoods but carried on because it suited their political aims, making real public discussion impossible. On a brighter note, Orwell observed that regular folks often displayed more decency and smarts than those leading them. The Spanish workers and peasants he encountered were brave and united when fighting for their own immediate needs. They clearly understood their struggles and what would improve their lives. But time and again, they were let down by intellectuals and career revolutionaries who professed to have their backs while chasing their own agendas. The problem was never with those in need of change, but with the movements that declared they were pushing for it. Grassroots revolutions had constructive potential, whereas top-down ones were often destructive. These insights from Spain shaped every corner of Orwell's subsequent work. They fueled his skepticism about all political movements, even the ones he had a soft spot for. They underlined his belief in honesty as a political duty. They informed his concern about how language could be twisted and facts manipulated. They heightened his focus on the power dynamics and how revolutionaries often morphed into what they initially stood against. Above all, these lessons instilled in him the belief that guarding individual freedom and independent thinking trumped any specific political goal. From Spain, Orwell learned that true political progress couldn't be rushed through revolutions or utopian dreams. It called for careful, steady efforts to create institutions resilient to corruption and protective of individual rights. It demanded an ongoing watch against political movements betraying their original ideals. It required a skeptical approach to grand ideologies and a focus on real-world impacts. Most crucially, it needed individuals ready to speak the truth about their experiences, regardless of political convenience. Without such truth-tellers, all political movements were doomed to end up as new forms of tyranny. Part 16. Memory, History, and the Control of the Past. George Orwell really hit the nail on the head when he pointed out that those who hold the reins to the past also control the future, and that those in power today have a grip on yesteryear. This idea, put across through the slogan in Orwell's 1984, is a profound insight into how political power works. History isn't just a rundown of everything that's happened. It's a powerful tool that shapes folks' identities, how they see their community, and what they envision down the road. If you can mess around with people's recollections of history, you can also tweak how they think in the present, rendering other futures literally inconceivable. So the fight for political freedom is really a fight to keep history honest. Orwell picked up on this from watching firsthand how different political groups played fast and loose with historical facts. During the Spanish Civil War, he saw how communist spin doctors changed the story of battles that had just taken place a few days or weeks back. Things he'd watched with his own eyes were flat out denied, downplayed, or totally reimagined to suit the political climate of the moment. Depending on which way the political winds were blowing, heroes could suddenly turn into traitors and vice versa. The past was as changeable and fluid as the present. It didn't matter what truly happened. The only thing of importance was which version of the event served the party's objectives at the time. This wasn't just about lying about this or that event. It was a more organized campaign to mess with the mental frameworks people used to grasp historical events. If the party succeeded in convincing folks that two contradictory ideas could both be true, the concept of historical accuracy would lose all meaning. If they could make everyone believe the party had always been correct, learning anything from past blunders would be impossible. If the line between past and present blurred, moving towards a brighter future would become a head-scratcher. Twisting history became a way to mess with people's heads beyond mere propaganda. In Orwell's 1984, he took this idea to an extreme through the character Winston Smith, whose role is to tweak the historical records to line up with the party's present-day needs. When the party shifts its alliances, it's up to Winston to go through all records and change them to show the party has always been side by side with its current ally. If production numbers miss their mark, Winston needs to revise past forecasts so the present figures look like a win. When officials fall from grace, he erases them from records as if they never existed. The past turns into something that can be bent however the current moment requires. Nothing before now has any reality by itself. But Orwell knew that this twisting of history wasn't something only seen in dictatorships. Every government and political group rewrites history to a certain extent to defend their current policies and boost their image. Even democratic societies aren't above making their past look a bit shinier, playing up their victories, and leaving out the blemishes. It's more about how much they do it rather than whether they do it at all. Conversely, in totalitarian states, historical memory control is absolute, while in democracies, it's more about influence. Still, the underlying pattern is similar in both situations. The real danger of history manipulation comes from the fact that most folks don't have firsthand experience of past events. They depend on documents, records, and stories written by others. If these get tainted, people have no way of figuring out what actually went down. They rely on the authorities as the keepers of their own history, making them easy pickings for those looking to sway their views beyond just political choices. It's a full package deal that rewires how they understand what's possible, normal, and worth striving for. Orwell saw this process happening not just with groups, but with individuals too. People often recast their memories to fit who they are now and their current beliefs. They remember being behind policies they once opposed and forget supporting what they now stand against. People often make their past seem more impressive and cover up their mistakes. This human habit ends up making us blind to our own manipulation. We tend to want stories about our past that boost our present-day self-esteem. On a bigger scale, nations do something similar with history, but the stakes are higher. They teach polished versions of their past, focusing on heroic deeds and brushing aside embarrassing chapters. In doing so, they create myths that back up current power structures, hiding the messy reality of how things really evolved. These myths turn complex historical figures into simple icons that support modern-day politics. While this kind of mythologized history can serve to keep societies emotionally afloat and politically motivated, it leads to trouble because it stops societies from learning from their actual past blunders. They end up making the same mistakes, pretending those errors never happened in the first place. So it's a big deal to keep an honest record of history. Someone's got to be brave enough to remember and document the real events, even when it's risky or doesn't fit the current agenda. This task calls for systems that protect historians, journalists, and others who track our collective history. Schools should teach students how to critically think about historical sources, while archives and documents need to be saved and protected by law and culture. More importantly, we need people who care about truth over comfort, ready to stand up for what's true even when it's unpopular. Orwell knew that you couldn't expect history to be totally objective or free of political influence. Every history book is written from a certain viewpoint and with certain goals in mind. Choosing what goes in the history books and how stories get told always comes with judgment calls, reflecting the author's values and beliefs. So aiming for perfect objectivity might not only be impossible, but also not helpful. What's needed is to keep a mix of views alive so no single narrative dominates what everyone thinks happened. Having a diversity of historical interpretations acts as a safeguard against those who might want to twist history for their gain. Orwell's idea was that personal memory serves as an important form of political pushback. In his novel 1984, when Winston remembers that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it means more than just maths. It's about holding on to his grip on reality, something the party can't fully control. His recollections of his past, even if they're a bit hazy, offer a truth that questions the official story from those in power. Holding on to personal memories becomes an act of rebellion, needing no group, money, or permission. It's the most fundamental and probably vital kind of resistance available to people under oppressive rule. Chapter 17. Learning, Knowledge, and the Crafting of Minds. George Orwell had a strong belief that education held the most potent power to either uplift or suppress people within any society. The way young minds are shaped by their community essentially decides the adults they turn into and the kind of world they will help to build. Education can cultivate the ability to think independently, critically examine issues, and make moral choices, skills essential for a healthy democracy. However, it can also instill a tendency to comply, blend in, and stop questioning, making people easy to sway and control. The line between educating and indoctrinating is often faint, but the outcomes are profoundly different. Societies that fail in proper education are at risk of losing their freedom, no matter what political systems they have in place. Orwell's own time studying at Eton College gave him a first-hand look at how top schools prepared future leaders' mindsets. Eton didn't focus mainly on academics. Instead, it used traditions, rituals, and social rankings to teach students to see themselves as naturally superior and destined to lead. Here they learned to gain compliance without ever mulling over whether their directives were right or fair, adopting a leader's mindset long before gaining the necessary wisdom or knowledge for it. This gap between self-assurance and actual ability caused significant problems for Britain and its empire. Orwell was also quite critical of the education given to working-class kids. These schools aim more to create obedient workers, not independent thinkers. The focus was on memorization over analysis, uniformity over creativity, compliance over curiosity. Students ended up just doing as told without understanding why or thinking about the bigger picture. They were drilled to accept and carry out decisions from others, not contribute to those decisions themselves, making them skilled but politically inert. The materials taught in schools held equal weight with teaching methods. The lessons in history, literature, science, and politics molded students' views on what people can or can't do. If education painted current social setups as unchangeable, students wouldn't dare to imagine alternatives. If it portrayed human nature as selfish and combative, they would doubt the feasibility of teamwork and selflessness. If it suggested simple fixes for tough problems, students would fall prey to leaders promising quick fixes for complex issues. Thus, the curriculum often served as a subtle form of political influence. Orwell noted how oppressive regimes used education systems to churn out the citizens they wanted. In Nazi Germany, schools were restructured to instill racial ideology, military strictness, and blind loyalty to the state. Students learned to prize group identity over individual ideas and put the nation's interests above their own. Critical thinking was discouraged as a form of betrayal, and challenging authority was seen as weakness. Education became the tool for breeding loyal followers who would carry out the government's orders without questioning morally or intellectually. Similar trends were seen in the Soviet Union and other oppressive regimes. However, clearly, democratic societies face their own hurdles with education. Democracy relies on citizens who can ponder over complex political matters independently and make educated decisions regarding different policy suggestions. Offering this kind of education is much harder than the rudimentary brainwashing used by authoritarian systems. It needs teachers who think for themselves and inspire questioning, even when this questioning goes against their own views. It demands schools to be safeguarded from political interference and commercial interests. To really value free thought over just sticking to popular ideas, one needs to nurture a society that cherishes intellectual freedom. Orwell placed great emphasis on teaching kids how to think critically. This meant getting them to suss out good evidence, spot dodgy logic, and see through propaganda. They had to see how words could twist their thinking and how numbers might be used to back up dodgy claims. He wanted them to be bold enough to challenge popular opinions and authority figures. And if new facts emerged that didn't match with their old views, they should be ready to change their minds with ease. This kind of mental agility was crucial not just for personal growth, but for moving society forward too. But Orwell didn't stop at boosting brainpower. He thought education should also build up our moral compass. Kids needed to learn to feel empathy, show kindness, and care about others' well-being. They needed to grasp that what they did had wider consequences beyond just their personal gain. Plus, they had to be brave enough to stick to what's right, even when it's tough or risky. Just knowing things wasn't enough. Without a moral grounding, you risk creating smart but uncaring people. The big goal was to shape well-rounded individuals, not just sharpen their logic. Orwell saw literature and the arts as key pieces of education. These subjects opened young minds to the vastness of human life and helped grow their creative and emotional sides. Books showed them different mindsets and emotions, broadening their view of what people could be. Through art, they learned to value beauty and tap into their own creativity. While some folks shrugged off these subjects as useless, Orwell saw them as critical to making fully rounded humans. A society that ditched art for purely technical skills would end up with people who might be productive, but lack a soulful connection. He recognized reforming education wouldn't be a walk in the park because current systems often benefited those already winning under the current setup. Elite schools wouldn't want to shake the boat if it meant losing their graduates' perks. Schools serving lower-income communities might resist changes that would empower their students to push back. Politicians might not be keen on creating citizens who think for themselves, and businesses might resist changes that lead to fewer compliant workers and consumers. The challenge was to go against these powerful groups holding tightly to the status quo. But Orwell saw changing things up as necessary to building a real democratic society. Education was too crucial to leave just to teachers. It needed everyone, parents, communities, and democratic systems, to get involved. Schools had to be watchful, making sure classes weren't swayed by political or commercial goals. Above all, every kid, no matter their background, should have a shot at an education that lets them reach their full human potential. This wasn't just the right thing to do. It was essential for keeping society both free and thriving. Part 18. George Orwell had a pretty deep take on human nature that didn't lean too heavily on being either overly hopeful or overly cynical. He thought folks were capable of doing great things and terrible things, sometimes both in the same person. What pushed someone one way or the other wasn't anything fixed in them, but rather the social, political, and economic settings they were in. Change those, and people's behavior could fundamentally shift. This was key to his political views because it suggested that making real-world changes didn't require the impossible task of changing human nature itself. Whether people acted better or worse really depended on the systems and incentives shaping their everyday lives. Orwell's view of human behavior came from seeing people in tough situations firsthand. As a colonial cop in Burma, he watched how the imperial system twisted everyone involved. When he explored poverty in places like Paris, London, and northern England, he noticed how being poor messed with people's ability to act morally. And during the Spanish Civil War, he saw how political chaos brought out both the best bravery and the worst cruelty in average folks. These experiences showed him that human behavior was way more changeable and influenced by context than most political thinkers imagined. People weren't naturally good or evil. They adjusted to whatever situations they were in. This way of thinking explained why institutions mattered so much to Orwell. Places that applauded working together and honesty would encourage those traits in people. On the other hand, environments that pushed competition and selfishness wouldn't bring out the best in anyone. The same person could be generous in one scenario and cruel in another. Therefore, social change should zero in on fixing the systems instead of trying to change individuals. Set up the right conditions, and better behavior would naturally evolve. But Orwell also got that human psychology had some universal traits any realistic political plan had to acknowledge. People seem to crave status and recognition. This could be aimed at good or bad things. They form groups, which could build unity internally but also stir conflict with outsiders. Many had a knack for self-deception, sticking to comforting beliefs even against clear facts. Plus, they sought purpose, which could be fulfilled by either noble goals or harmful fixations. These patterns weren't necessarily issues to be solved, but aspects to be wisely managed. Orwell paid special attention to the thirst for power in his take on human psychology. Some folks seem driven by an endless need to control others, not just as a means to an end like wealth or safety, but as its own end. Such people were drawn to political arenas and institutions offering them a stage to wield influence. They were good at using lofty language to mask their real quest for power. You could find these power-hungry types across the political board, from fascists to communists to Democrats. Power-seeking individuals in political movements posed a big risk that noble goals could get sidetracked by self-serving agendas. People who joined up to fight wrongs might end up serving leaders fixed on their own gain. Revolutionary groups aiming to free people might turn into tools for new kinds of oppression. Democratic setups meant to work for the greater good might get taken over by special interests looking out for themselves. The way to fight against corruption is to always be on alert and have systems in place that prevent any one person or group from gaining too much control. Because of human nature, we have the potential for both freedom and oppression, and it all comes down to how smartly we design our institutions. Orwell was really interested in why people tend to give in intellectually and morally. He noticed that a lot of folks would rather be told what to think than actually think things through themselves. Going your own way is tough and often isolating, while just going along with everyone else gives you that cozy feeling of fitting in. This tendency makes people easy prey for smooth-talking leaders in authoritarian movements. They'd happily trade their personal judgment for the comfort of having someone else dictate their beliefs and values. Most of the time, this isn't even coerced. People do it voluntarily, sometimes even eagerly. Totalitarian ideologies are appealing partly because they cater to this desire for clear-cut beliefs and moral direction. They give easy answers to complicated issues and clear paths for those feeling lost. They promise to take away the anxiety that comes with making moral and political decisions on your own. They give a sense of purpose that's sometimes missing in freer societies. But the catch is, you lose your individual freedom for this comfort. A lot of people are okay with that trade-off. They choose the certainty of being enslaved over the responsibility of being free. However, Orwell also saw that people could be incredibly brave and independent when the situation called for it. Regular folks could stand up to enormous pressure if they had something worth fighting for. They could hold on to their values even when faced with torture or death. They could keep a clear head and make wise decisions even when everything around them was chaos. The same person could be either courageous or cowardly, depending on the situation and the kind of moral upbringing and education they'd had. Orwell's nuanced take on human psychology led him to dismiss both overly optimistic and overly pessimistic political ideas. Idealistic plans that assumed people would naturally act selflessly were doomed because they ignored how naturally selfish and power-hungry people can be. On the other hand, just accepting injustice as a given was also wrong because it overlooked the potential for moral improvement and cooperation among people. Realistic political approaches need to work with people as they truly are, not as we'd like them to be. These plans need to encourage selfish desires to benefit society while also nurturing selfless actions. The goal isn't to perfect human nature, but to create an environment where the best parts of human nature are more likely to win out. Part 19. George Orwell, known for rejecting religion, yet grasped how deeply people crave purpose and meaning, traditionally met by religion. Although he didn't believe in the supernatural, he saw that pure reason wasn't enough to sustain us. People needed beliefs that felt bigger than their immediate wants. They wanted a reason to care for others and strive for goals beyond their own lifetimes. As more folks drifted away from religious faith, it left a gap that politics and ideologies eagerly tried to fill. Orwell realized this gap was both a chance and a risk for humanity. Orwell's own drift from faith happened gradually as he grew up. Raised in English middle-class Christianity, his time in Burma and seeing poverty made him question the idea of a kind God. If God were real, how could such unfairness continue? If the church truly cared about people, why did it often align with the powerful rather than the powerless? These thoughts led him to a humanist view, focusing on human welfare rather than divine rules. To Orwell, people had worth because they were people, not due to being made in God's likeness or having a heavenly fate. Even though shifting from religious to secular values solved some issues, it stirred up new ones. Religion, despite its logical flaws, had given people a sense of deep importance and ultimate purpose. It encouraged moral behavior, even against one's interests, offering comfort in tough times and hope despite death. Secular humanism could rationalize morality, but struggled to offer the emotional fulfillment and security that religion did. Many discovered that even when life was comfortable and free, it sometimes felt empty without spiritual meaning. This emptiness made them ripe for political ideologies claiming to give back that lost sense of purpose. Fascism and communism acted like secular religions, providing their followers with a sense of grand purpose and historical duty, promising that personal sacrifice would contribute to achieving ultimate goals like racial purity or a classless society. They crafted rituals and symbols to meet the need for transcendent experiences, building communities much like religious groups. For many, these political beliefs filled the gap left by waning traditional religion. But Orwell was wary, seeing them as even more dangerous than their religious counterparts because they laid claim to this world, not just the next. Where religious leaders could only promise rewards in the afterlife, political leaders could claim their failures were just bumps in the road to earthly utopia. They could demand endless sacrifices for goals perpetually just out of reach, leading to fanaticism and cruelty, exceeding even the worst religious conflicts. Political religions mixed faith's irrational side with real-world goals. Orwell believed societies needed to find meaning and purpose without leaning into totalitarian ideas or running back to supernatural beliefs. This meant crafting a kind of secular spirituality that could meet our need for something greater while preserving truth and freedom. Art, literature, music, and philosophy could offer beauty and meaning, enriching lives without demanding belief in the untrue. Science, with its revelations, could satisfy our curiosity about the universe. Getting involved in democracy could help folks feel like they're making a difference and having a purpose in the grand scheme of things. Connecting with others can offer love and the kind of ties that make life personally valuable. The trick is in finding meaning that aligns with reality rather than turning a blind eye to facts or stifling your critical side. Many traditional faiths have often asked people to believe things that don't always line up with what we can see. Meanwhile, political ideologies might demand loyalty to ideas or leaders, even when they clearly fumble. Secular humanism, on the other hand, suggests finding meaning in values that stand strong when challenged by logic and real-life experiences. Compassion holds weight because pain and hardship are undeniably real. Chasing down the truth is vital because having a clearer picture of reality improves life for everyone. Crafting beauty has its own worth because it lifts the human spirit. These ideals don't need any otherworldly backing because their benefits are clear as day. Orwell recognized that knowing life is finite adds a unique flavor to it, one that everlasting existence could never match. The brevity of life makes every moment special, urging people to consider what holds true meaning. Death unites us in our shared fate, turning what seems bleak into something that underscores the value of every choice we make. Unlike promises of forever, realizing life's shortness adds depth. On a broader scale, if this is the only life we live, then making it better becomes essential, not something to be sidetracked by loftier goals. Taking steps to lessen suffering becomes crucial because there's no future reward to balance things out. Justice becomes non-negotiable as there's no grand cosmic justice to right the scales. Each generation must step up to improve the world since no outside force will wave a magic wand. In many respects, secular humanism asks individuals to be more focused on human welfare than religious beliefs that assure eventual redemption. Yet Orwell also saw that meaning in a secular frame was delicate and often shaky, easily knocked off course in hard times. This kind of meaning relies on society and culture, which can themselves be threatened by political and economic stress. It can't offer the comforting certainty of good triumphing over evil like faith-based views sometimes do. Secular folks have to learn to live with life's gray areas, which believers might sidestep through faith. This was part of the challenge and the dignity found in the humanistic outlook. For secular societies, the big task is fostering cultures that uphold meaning and purpose without turning to false comforts or heavy-handed doctrines. This involves being open to different paths to finding meaning while sticking to values we share, such as truth, freedom, and respect for human dignity. It involves creating systems that uphold people's freedom while encouraging community spirit. Education should cultivate not just thoughtful analysis, but a strong moral compass. Most importantly, it takes individuals who can appreciate life's everyday moments without needing the universe's approval or a promise of eternity. This might be the toughest task for modern societies, but it's definitely one of the most important. Part 20. George Orwell realized that the 20th century was a pivotal moment in human history. For the first time ever, tech advancements were happening way faster than our ability to figure out how to use them wisely. New ways to communicate, travel, make stuff, and wage war opened doors for both freedom and oppression, things our ancestors couldn't even dream of. The very same gadgets and systems that could wipe out poverty and connect us globally also had the power to spy on us and control us, making old-school tyrannies look like the good old days. The future of freedom really hinged on whether democracies could get a grip on these technologies before the technologies took over. That was the big question of the modern world. During Orwell's time, he saw the beginning of this tech shift. The radio and movies brought about new ways to talk to masses of people all at once. Planes and mechanical warfare were changing how wars were fought. Mass production was making tons of stuff like never before, bringing about new ways of organizing society. Each of these shifts altered the balance of power between people and institutions, shaking up politics big time. Some technologies seemed harmless or even good at first, but turned out to have oppressive sides when fully unleashed. Orwell's big contribution to the tech politics discussion was his view that if we didn't actively make efforts to avoid it, tech would definitely end up being used for political control. Just because free societies invented these technologies didn't mean they'd automatically serve freedom. They'd be molded to fit whoever was in control. In dictatorships, that meant using tech to tighten the grip on power. In democracies, the outcome wasn't clear, but it was just as crucial. Keeping technology in line with democratic ideals required constant attention and an active approach to steer tech development in the right direction. The dance between tech and freedom was tricky because tech progress brought real benefits while also introducing new threats. Mass communication could spread propaganda and enforce surveillance, but it could also enhance education and boost democracy. Methods of transportation could help with invasions and control, but they could also boost trade and cultural exchange. Production technology held the potential for economic dependence and environmental harm, but it could also end scarcity and reduce the drudgery of work. How these tech tools were used depended on who held the reins. Orwell foresaw that future battles would be more about controlling info, not land or resources. Whoever shaped the narrative controlled reality. This turned mass communication tools into mighty weapons, sometimes more powerful than armies. A government that kept a lid on all info sources could sway public opinion so much that opposing the regime would seem impossible. Folks would back policies that worked against them because they wouldn't really get what those policies entailed. Democracy could turn into just a front for an information-driven dictatorship. But Orwell also saw hope that these info technologies might serve democracy if set up to promote open exchange of ideas. Differing news sources could help fight off propaganda and falsehoods. Technologies that allowed two-way conversations could empower everyday folks to join in on political talks, not just passively soak up what the leaders dished out. In today's world, communication networks spread far and wide, making it tricky for any one government to completely control the flow of information within its borders. While these technologies could lead to never-before-seen levels of control and oppression, they also hold the potential to open doors for more democratic involvement. The outcome really hinges on how these technologies are developed and implemented within existing institutional structures. George Orwell had a real worry about how technological advancements would impact people's minds. As life became more complex and fast-moving, individuals found it harder to focus on big questions. The relentless stream of information and constant noise were overwhelming people's ability to think deeply and quietly. This constant distraction was eating away at their ability to focus on one thing at a time or to chase long-term goals that need consistent effort. People started relying more on these external technologies for tasks they used to handle themselves. This dependency made them easier to manipulate and less likely to think independently. Besides, the fast pace of tech changes was causing social and cultural shifts that left people uneasy about the future and yearning for a past that might never have existed. Traditional lifestyles were breaking down quicker than new ways could be set up and understood, leaving people feeling lost and open to authoritarian ideas that promised to bring back order and meaning. The advantages of modern technology weren't being shared equally, leading to fresh forms of inequality, even as some enjoyed a new abundance. Those unable to keep up with tech transitions found themselves lagging both economically and socially. These disruptions stirred political instability that put democratic institutions at risk. Orwell thought the key to handling tech changes while keeping human freedom intact was through new means of democratic engagement and control. He argued that you couldn't just let tech experts make all the decisions because their choices carried heavy political and social weight. It's vital for citizens to grasp enough about technology to engage in discussions on how it should evolve and be utilized. Democratic systems needed to create new ways to manage technological growth and ensure it prioritized the public good over private gain. We'd also need international teamwork to tackle tech challenges that went beyond national lines. Above all, society needed to develop solid values and principles to guide their technological decisions rather than simply chasing new tech for the heck of it. Orwell's ultimate question regarding technology in modern times was whether humans could keep their own inventions under control. Every leap in technology introduced new capabilities that changed life in unforeseen ways. The combined effects might shift human nature itself in ways today's generations can't predict or manage. Future humans could end up being as different from us as we are from our pre-technological ancestors. Whether this transformation would signify progress or decline depended on whether it bolstered or weakened the qualities that make life valuable. Protecting human freedom, dignity, and moral responsibility in this tech-driven era would demand wisdom, bravery, and unflagging oversight from every generation. So, in Part 21, which explores the concepts of work, labor, and human dignity, George Orwell had a clear grasp of the fact that the way a society organizes work affects not only its economic output, but also the nature and worth of its people. Most of us spend the bulk of our daytime working, and those hours mold our relationships, sense of purpose, and self-worth. When work is structured in a way that treats folks like machines or mere commodities, it weakens their ability to think independently and act morally. Conversely, when jobs are set up to honor human dignity and promote personal growth, work becomes fulfilling and sparks social ties. Changing work environments was key to any real social reform. Orwell's take on work was deeply influenced by his first-hand experience of manual labor, while exploring poverty in Paris and London. He did stints as a dishwasher in upscale eateries, where he saw the undercurrents that enabled middle-class ease. He observed how employers and patrons treated workers, and he personally felt the fatigue, pressure, and degradation tied to jobs that offered no stability, respect, or chances to move up. Plus, he realized how financial desperation pushes people to accept degrading work conditions, robbing them of their fundamental human dignity. Poverty wasn't just about lacking cash. It was about losing autonomy and self-respect to stay afloat. What really bugged Orwell about the capitalist work setup was how it detached people from the fruits of their labor. Workers in factories and kitchens would carry out monotonous tasks without grasping or controlling the bigger picture of what their efforts contributed to. They became mere cogs in machines they didn't own or influence. This disconnect left them alienated from their own abilities, rendering work meaningless, even if it served a societal need. They missed out on the joy of crafting something useful or lovely. Earning a living became the sole purpose, overshadowing the notion of contributing to societal well-being. The division of labor, good for industrial efficiency, also set up stiff layers that separated classes with distinct life tales. Those in mental jobs often looked down on manual laborers, owners scoffed at workers, and decision-makers snubbed those who followed orders. These divides erected mental walls, making it tough for people to see their shared humanity. Empathy and understanding for those in different work streams slipped away. Yet Orwell noticed that even in the toughest working scenarios, people held on to their dignity and creativity. The dishwashers and coal miners he worked with crafted informal networks of support and resistance, helping them stay human. They took pride in their tasks, despite societal undervaluation, and built supportive communities that offered purpose beyond mere paycheck concerns. They showed that oppressive economic setups couldn't fully strip away human dignity. This resilience made Orwell optimistic that improved work conditions could unlock untapped human potential. Orwell imagined democratic socialism as a means to revamp work relations, emphasizing human dignity and growth. Workers deserved control over their workspaces and a say in production decisions. They needed to see how their personal contributions linked to broader social goals and have chances to learn and grow, reaching their full potential. Above all, they should be regarded as human beings, not just parts of a production line. Work should nurture human growth rather than hamper it to meet production demands. Such transformation called for more than changing who owns what. It demanded a re-examination of the very reasons behind economic activities. Instead of focusing on making the most money for owners, societies should aim to set up production in a way that benefits everyone's well-being. Rather than putting efficiency on a pedestal, they should balance it with values like creativity, security, and community. Instead of seeing inequality as an unavoidable consequence of market competition, they should strive to ensure everyone has access to meaningful work and a decent quality of life. Achieving this would mean making changes to both institutions and culture. Orwell grasped that technology could either make work more enriching or strip it of its humanity, all depending on its development and application. Machines have the power to take away dangerous and monotonous tasks, freeing people up for more creative and fulfilling pursuits, but they could also be employed to enhance worker surveillance and control more than any previous management systems. The trick is to steer technological progress towards satisfying human needs, rather than bending human needs to fit technological demands. To do this, decisions about technology shouldn't be left solely to experts or private owners, but should involve democratic participation. Workers need a say in how technology is applied in their work environments. Ultimately, the aim is to build a society where everyone can contribute their skills and efforts for the common good, while also nurturing their personal potential. Work should be seen as a source of fulfillment and social connection, not just something to endure in order to live. This doesn't mean every job will be a breeze or always pleasant, but it does mean recognizing the value of all work and treating all workers with respect. The dignity of the work should be mirrored by the dignity of those who do it. This transformation is both a practical economic aim and a moral necessity for any society claiming to cherish human equality and freedom. Without these changes, democracy would feel unfinished and true social justice would remain out of reach. Part 22. The Thinker and the Everyman. George Orwell often delved into the tricky dynamic between thinkers and the average person in today's democracies. Although he was part of the intellectual crowd, he was very skeptical about their tendency to be arrogant, overly theoretical, and disconnected from the everyday human experience. Yet he knew that thinkers have important duties that nobody else could tackle. They were supposed to keep culture intact, speak out against power abuses, and protect the truth in societies constantly at risk from propaganda and deceit. The real challenge was figuring out how intellectuals could handle these duties without losing their connection to the people they're meant to help. This meant they needed a whole new way of thinking about their place and function in society. Orwell was pretty tough on intellectuals because he noticed they often lived in a kind of bubble, out of touch with the real-world impact of the ideas they pushed. University folks might back some wild economic schemes without ever having to live with the fallout of those ideas. Literary critics might rave about artsy movements that didn't really connect with what regular folks wanted or needed to read. Political thinkers could spin elaborate theories without a thought for how they'd actually play out in the real world. This distance made intellectuals risky. It led them to see people as mere tools for achieving abstract objectives instead of valuable in their own right. They missed the actual human goals that their intellectual work should aim to support. The issue got worse because intellectuals tended to invent their own lingo and problems that didn't make sense to anyone outside their circle. Academic fields birthed complicated jargon that clouded rather than clarified big ideas. Debates became about topics that only mattered to other thinkers, instead of addressing real issues that affected ordinary lives. Instead of straightforward moral clarity, they leaned towards intricate theoretical arguments. Such specialization benefited intellectuals by presenting their knowledge as critical, but it also cut them off from the wider public they were supposed to inform. They became like a separate group with their own set of priorities and alliances. Orwell particularly called out those intellectuals who picked political sides based on abstract theories rather than real-world outcomes. He observed how some Western thinkers backed Stalin's rule just because it seemed theoretically sound for socialism, completely ignoring the resulting horrors and suppression. Similarly, he saw conservative intellectuals supporting colonial policies due to theoretical ideas about advancement, despite the massive harm those policies caused. In both instances, these thinkers clung more to their theories than to the people affected by them. They lost sight of the fact that political theories should serve to enhance human welfare, not become goals in themselves that excuse any approach to make them happen. Confusing the means with the ends was not only mentally corrupt but also a moral trap. However, Orwell didn't dismiss the value of thinkers entirely. He saw them as irreplaceable in certain roles. They safeguarded and passed down the cultural stories that lent meaning and continuity to civilization. They questioned and uncovered lies and contradictions of the powerful. They taught, allowing people to grasp complex concepts and build their critical thinking skills. They were the creators, writers and artists, who portrayed and communicated the essence of human life. Without effective intellectuals, society's ability to reflect and reform would shrink. The goal was for thinkers to do these jobs in ways that genuinely helped regular folks, not just other intellectuals. This meant breaking things down in a way that was understandable to anyone, not just experts. It meant zooming in on topics that were relevant to everyday life instead of just feeding the academic machine. So, they had to put their ideas to the test in the real world instead of getting caught up in more and more intricate theoretical debates. The key was to stay grounded and remember that they didn't know everything and could be wrong in their judgments. Being intellectually savvy should make you wiser about the messiness of human issues, not make you cocky about thinking you can solve them all. Orwell thought that bookish folks had a lot to learn from regular people if they just listened humbly and respectfully. Sometimes good old common sense offered better advice than fancy theories for the nitty-gritty of living and working together. Everyday people, dealing head-on with economic and social realities, often had insights that ivory tower thinkers missed. Regular folks usually had values and priorities that were more sensible than the highfalutin theories cooked up by the pros. Ignoring or looking down on what average people had to say meant intellectuals were missing out on valuable truths and understanding. Plus, it guaranteed their fancy ideas wouldn't have any real-world impact. But Orwell also knew that everyday folk could learn a lot from the know-how and perspectives intellectuals offered. In today's super complicated societies, problems can't always be solved with just common sense. Getting a handle on economics, politics, science, and culture takes some specialized knowledge that most people don't have the time to dive into. Intellectuals could be those handy guides who help folks see the big forces and trends shaping their lives, which might not be immediately obvious. The deal between the brainy types and the common folks should be about respecting each other and learning together, not about looking down one's nose either way. Both sides bring something crucial to the table in the shared goal of making a better world. For this ideal partnership to work, intellectuals need to ditch their superior attitudes, and regular folks should get more chances to learn and soak up culture. Those with specialized smarts must remember that knowing stuff is a privilege with duties, not a badge of honor. Common folks need room to grow intellectually too, rather than just bowing to the experts. Education should be open to everyone, no matter where they come from, and cultural hubs should cater to the general public, not just the fancy pants crowd. The aim is to break down the fake walls between the thinkers and the everyday people, while keeping the real advantages that intellectual pursuits can bring to the table for society at large. Section 23. Art, Beauty, and Defending Our Society. George Orwell once said that art and beauty aren't just nice-to-haves for societies that have sorted out their basic needs. They're actually central to human life, adding depth and worth to everything we do. If a society puts all its focus on practical matters and forgets about art, it might achieve wealth, but it would lose its soul. Likewise, if art doesn't pay attention to what's going on in the world, it misses the chance to speak to people fighting for justice and freedom. The trick is to make art that's both beautiful and meaningful. To do this, you've got to ditch the notion that beauty and truth, or art and politics, can't mix. Orwell's own works show how being politically aware can actually make art better, not worse. In Animal Farm, the political story hits home because it's first a gripping story with characters we can all relate to. 1984 makes us see the terrors of dictatorship because it turns complex political ideas into real human struggles. Even his essays about words and politics were powerful because they were written so clearly and craftily. In every case, the political punch was stronger because the art itself was top-notch. Good politics and good art go hand in hand, requiring honesty about what's going on in the world. However, Orwell noted that dictatorships posed a big danger to artistic freedom and creativity. They wanted all cultural works to fit their agenda, turning art into propaganda and literature into brainwashing. Beauty became whatever the rulers needed it to be. Artists had to make things that praised the regime and slammed its enemies. If an artist dared to think for themselves, it was seen as being against the state. This not only made for bad politics, but also terrible art, failing to achieve either artistic greatness or moral goals. Orwell saw this in action in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, where talented artists were trapped into making art that went against their principles. Some escaped to countries where they could continue to create freely. Others tried to sneak their messages in under the radar, and some just gave in, becoming propagandists for the state. In every case, when art was forced to toe the political line, both the art and the politics suffered for it. Societies that can't handle free thinking in art eventually lose the ability to think freely in other areas too. This is why Orwell argued that artistic freedom is crucial for political freedom. Art allows people to dream and view the world in ways that aren't influenced by collective pressure. It holds on to ways of understanding and feeling that might be otherwise stamped out by powerful political and social forces. It gives us experiences of beauty and meaning that go beyond current political squabbles. Most importantly, it shows that humans can create things just for the joy of it, not just as a means to an end. This kind of creation is something machines can't do, and it's part of what makes human life so precious. But Orwell also warned against thinking art could be completely separated from moral or political issues. Artists who think they're above politics might actually be unknowingly supporting the powerful. Art that turns a blind eye to injustice and suffering ends up being part of the problem. Beauty that comes at the cost of human pain isn't true beauty, it's morally rotten. Real artistic honesty means tackling all parts of the human experience, even the tough and ugly ones. Artists have a duty to reflect the truth of their times, no matter how hard that might be. The goal is to create art that stands true to itself while also serving a good cause. To achieve art that embodied truth instead of simply serving propaganda, we needed artists dedicated to capturing the complexity of humanity rather than sticking to simplified ideological views. This meant reaching audiences ready to tackle challenging and unsettling artistic visions, instead of those seeking simple comfort and reassurance. It also called for cultural institutions that backed artistic freedom while promoting social responsibility. Most importantly, societies had to cherish both beauty and justice, understanding that achieving one without the other was impossible. Art and morality weren't in opposition, but rather they were two sides of the same coin, essential for human prosperity. George Orwell argued that exposure to remarkable art could nurture people's moral sensitivities in ways that abstract ethics teaching couldn't match. Literature could spark empathy by placing readers in the shoes of others with life experiences unlike their own. Visual arts could open people's eyes to beauty and meaning in parts of life they previously ignored. Music could induce emotional states that broaden individuals' capacity for feeling and expression. These experiences weren't meant to replace moral thinking, but to form the groundwork upon which moral reasoning stands. People who've never encountered beauty might struggle to grasp why it should be cherished and preserved. This is why Orwell emphasized making art accessible to everyone, not just a privileged few with higher education or spare time. Access to beauty and cultural experiences should be available to all, not just those who could pay for it. Public support should aim for art that contributes to the public good rather than the selective interests of private preferences. Educational programs should integrate artistic and cultural education alongside practical skills to foster both aesthetic appreciation and practical abilities. The point wasn't turning every person into an artist, but ensuring everyone could experience and appreciate the height of human creativity. This democratic cultural perspective was crucial for building societies that honored human dignity and fostered personal growth. Yet Orwell realized that true art couldn't be the product of committee decisions or mass production. It needed individual vision, personal spark, and the freedom to explore novel ideas and experiences without immediate practical outcomes. When societies tried to tightly control art, they ended up with propaganda instead of true artistry. The best way to inspire great art was by crafting conditions where artists could create with independence, ensuring their work reached audiences who would value and benefit from it. Striking the balance between artistic freedom and social obligation Personal expression and community welfare was no easy task. It was a delicate, ever-evolving equilibrium, crucial for securing both artistic brilliance and human civilization at large. Part 24. Okay, so George Orwell lived through a time when democratic governments were really under pressure. Both fascist and communist groups were claiming they'd offer more efficient and decisive governance. Around him, he saw democratic governments in Europe crumble because they just couldn't handle economic troubles, social disputes, and military threats. But instead of losing hope in democracy, Orwell thought the real issue wasn't the democratic ideas themselves, but how they were being put into practice. He believed democracy could not only survive but thrive, as long as it was revamped and made stronger to tackle modern-day issues. This kind of change needed institutional adjustments and cultural shifts to make democratic participation more valuable and impactful. The whole future of human freedom hinged on getting these changes right. Orwell pointed out a big flaw in the current democratic systems. They didn't offer true equal participation. Sure, people had political rights on paper, but with so much economic imbalance, these rights were hard to exercise for most folks. Wealthy people could easily buy political power through things like campaign donations, lobbying, and even media ownership, while the average working person found it tough to have their voice heard. Schools were cranking out grads who were more about following orders than thinking critically when it came to political stuff. Plus, powerful groups controlled information systems, molding public opinion to fit their own agendas instead of serving the general public. So democracy became more of a cover for the rule of the wealthy few. Orwell was convinced that to fix these problems, democracy needed to spread beyond just politics into the economic realm too. If people didn't have a say in their workplace or financial safety, they couldn't engage equally in political decisions. Being reliant on powerful bosses and worried about just getting by made it hard to take the necessary risks to be truly politically active. Therefore, economic democracy wasn't just a nice-to-have, but essential for political democracy. This meant democratic reforms would need to tackle questions like who owns resources, who controls them, and how they're distributed. Real political equality couldn't exist without economic equality in a genuinely democratic society. Orwell also got that new, unforeseen challenges were popping up for democracy as the 20th century rolled on. Modern societies were too big and complex for everyone to have a direct say in all decisions. Although representative institutions were needed, they came with challenges regarding accountability and how well they really listened to people. Career politicians sometimes grew disconnected from their voters, and bureaucracies gained strength and resisted control by the people. Rapid changes in technology and society made it hard for democratic institutions to change fast enough to tackle new issues. On top of that, tools for mass communication like radio, movies, and eventually TV could be used to shape public opinion like never before. Those who controlled these platforms had huge power in framing political subjects. Crafty advertising tricks were used in politics to create agreement with policies that favored elites while acting like they were meeting public demands. The line between honest information and manipulation got really hazy, especially as advertising techniques started shaping political chatter. Democracy couldn't function if citizens couldn't get the right information about the decisions they needed to make. So keeping the honesty of public talk intact became just as crucial as ensuring fair voting and representation. Orwell thought overcoming these issues meant embracing new ways for people to participate in democracy beyond just casting votes in elections. People needed chances to get involved directly in decisions affecting their everyday lives, not just pick between candidates who maybe did or didn't have their interests at heart. Workplace democracy, along with community organizing and local self-governance, could serve as excellent places to develop the skills and mindset needed for wider democratic engagement. It's important for people to see democracy as a daily way of living, not just something you do when it's time to vote. This hands-on type of democracy, though more challenging than simply voting for representatives, would actually be better at achieving true self-governance. It would help shape people into active citizens rather than just casting voters. Education played a pivotal role in this democratic evolution. To be truly involved in democratic decision-making, Individuals need to grasp the ins and outs of the issues at hand and understand how decisions come to be made. This goes beyond just learning to read, write, and count. It includes developing critical thinking skills to weigh different opinions and spot when someone's trying to pull the wool over their eyes. Being grounded in history helps people see how today's problems came about and what past solutions have been tried. Scientific literacy is also needed so folks can wrap their heads around the tech and environmental challenges affecting our policies. Most crucially, we need moral teaching that fosters empathy, a sense of fairness, and a focus on the greater good. Orwell got that democratic setups are delicate and need constant care. Since such values and practices aren't passed down automatically, each generation has to learn anew how to uphold them. There will always be powerful groups trying to twist democratic processes for their own gain. Times of crisis might tempt societies to trade democratic methods for faster, more authoritarian ones. The pull of nationalism, racism, and other divisive motivations threatens the understanding and respect that democracy needs to thrive. Keeping democracy intact isn't a task you can check off once. It's an ongoing duty that requires every citizen's input. A true test for democratic systems is how well they adjust to change without losing their core values. New tech can open doors for citizen involvement, but also for tighter control from those in power. Global issues will call for cooperation that goes beyond national borders. Environmental problems will need plans and sacrifices hard for short-term focused democratic leaders to make. Without action through democratic means, economic inequality could undermine political equality. How we tackle these hurdles will decide whether democracy stays effective or if it's overtaken by autocratic systems that might be faster but would strip away our humanity. Orwell painted a picture of democracy that was both bright and clear-eyed. He had faith that regular folks could govern wisely if they had the right tools, knowledge, and chances needed for actual self-rule. However, he was well aware that keeping these conditions alive would demand ongoing work and alertness against forces that lean toward more structured and controlled ways of organizing society. Democracy wasn't something naturally found in human groups. It's a crafted achievement that needs to be deliberately built and constantly updated. Keeping democracy alive isn't only about staying aware, but also about putting in ongoing work to transform democratic dreams into reality. This task is both the responsibility and the honor of being a citizen in a free community. Part 25. As we wrap up this exploration of George Orwell's philosophical ideas, it's clear that all his thoughts and theories connect to form a big vision for human potential. Every part of his thinking, whether it's his take on language or his critiques on the nature of power, his economic viewpoints, or his psychological insights, had one main goal. Orwell aimed to figure out what conditions would allow people to live with dignity, be truly free, and find real happiness. He was on a mission to pinpoint the obstacles standing in the way of these conditions and to find ways to overcome them. His life's work boiled down to one practical question: how can we create a world that's worth living in? That's why his work keeps resonating with anyone who's invested in the future of humanity. Orwell got that freedom isn't something that'll just pop up if you remove outside restraints. It needs to be built actively and constantly protected against forces eager to crush it. These forces aren't just obvious enemies like dictatorships or unjust economic systems. They also include sneaky foes within us, like the ease of being mentally lazy, the fear of standing up for what's right, and our tendency to bow down to group pressure. The real battles for freedom aren't fought on grand stages, but inside people's minds and hearts. Every single person who picks truth over comfort, who sees through manipulation, and who thinks for themselves about big issues plays a part in preserving our freedom. This understanding made Orwell put a lot of weight on personal responsibility within larger societal and political movements. He wasn't into just focusing on the individual while ignoring the social context, nor was he keen on blending individual accountability into a collective identity. People are influenced by their environment, but they have the power to challenge and change those surroundings through their decisions and actions. Shifting society requires both policy changes and personal transformations. Better institutions can lead to better behavior, but we also need better behavior to improve and sustain those institutions. It's all linked, requiring work both individually and together. Orwell's idea of a free society was both daring and rooted. It was daring because it pushed for equality, democracy, and social justice, calling for big changes in how power is both shared and wielded. It meant challenging long-standing interests and revamping institutions that have been around for ages. But it was rooted in respecting human nature, cultural traditions, and the wise insights of regular folks. His goal was to keep what worked in people's ways of living while scrapping what was unfair and harsh. This mix of bold transformation and careful preservation shaped how he approached each big issue he tackled. He aimed to change economic systems while keeping cultural ties. He wanted more democracy, but with a solid foundation for individual rights. He was all for using technology for good, but humans must have the final say. While he supported global cooperation, he valued local independence. He pushed for wider access to education, but held on to the value of common sense and practical know-how. In every area, Orwell searched for solutions that put human freedom and dignity first, steering clear from getting tangled in abstract ideological goals. His political views were down-to-earth and focused on people rather than being strictly theoretical. One of the most crucial takeaways from Orwell, especially for today's world, is his grasp that the fight between freedom and tyranny is never over for good. Each generation is handed this challenge in new shapes, needing fresh solutions. Even as the specific threats to human freedom shift over time, the core dynamics stay the same. Those in power will always push to grow and solidify their influence. Those benefiting from how things are will push back against changes that might affect their perks. And those who are comfortable will always feel drawn to overlook the struggles of the less fortunate. The only way to fend off these tendencies is to always stay on guard and push back actively, especially if you cherish freedom over just being safe, truth over just being cozy, and justice over just having things in order. You've got to keep your eyes open yourself. You can't pass it off to someone else. Orwell's writings really highlight how vital it is to be intellectually honest when it comes to politics. From what he observed, it seemed that most political mess-ups didn't come from folks having evil plans, but rather from decent folks getting too comfortable with convenient untruths instead of facing hard-to-swallow truths. Intellectuals often turned a blind eye to the wrongdoings of movements they backed. Politicians kept making promises that they fully well knew they couldn't keep. Everyday people often chose to believe what made them feel better instead of what the facts actually pointed to. Every tiny step away from truth smoothed the path for bigger lies until the idea of truth got lost altogether. So, sticking up for the truth became one of the most important political acts. Those who insisted on keeping things straight and honest in public talks were basically standing up for the very core that allowed democracy to thrive. But maybe what Orwell underscored the most was showing how just being decent and human beat any fancy political ideas. The ability to notice suffering and want to do something about it. The knack for seeing people as ends in themselves, not just as stepping stones towards some other goal. Finding the guts to speak the truth, even when it's not the easiest path politically. Taking a stand for your values, even if it means paying a personal price. These down-to-earth human traits outvalue all the complicated ideological systems that offer so-called scientific solutions to political dilemmas. A society where people practice simple kindness would be freer and fairer than one that follows the most sophisticated political theories, but ignores basic human rights and needs. This was both a grounded and groundbreaking realization that not only challenged intellectual pride, but also reinforced the savvy of everyday folks. The world Orwell imagined wasn't some perfect place where everyone's problems were miraculously fixed. Instead, it was a world where people could live with a bit of dignity, speak freely, have jobs that brought satisfaction, and take part as equals in decisions impacting their lives. It was a world where truth mattered more than who had the power, where individual consciences were respected even if they clashed with the crowd's opinions, and where the future was steered by humans and not just left to impersonal forces. Such a world was within reach, but only if folks understood what was on the line and put in the effort to build something better than what they came into. Even now, more than 7 decades after Orwell left us, his vision holds strong relevance. The threats he pointed out may have morphed a bit, but the core warnings remain. New technologies open doors to both freedom and control. New kinds of economic setups bring about new sorts of inequalities alongside new riches. New political movements promise quick fixes for complex issues, but often ask us to park our critical thinking at the door. And fresh spins on propaganda take advantage of psychological flaws that Orwell highlighted years back. Despite all this, Orwell's insights give us hope that these issues can be tackled if we're smart enough to heed his wisdom and bold enough to act on it. The future of human liberty hinges not on the deeds of great leaders or massive systems, but on the everyday decisions made by ordinary folks. Whether they choose to think for themselves or let others do the thinking for them, whether they'll stick to the truth or let convenient falsehoods slide by, whether they'll defend their principles or just go with the flow, whether they aim for what's just or only follow their own agenda. These personal choices, multiplied by millions, will shape whether the 21st century blooms with human freedom or is marked by intricate tyranny. George Orwell equipped us with the tools to make these calls wisely. He guided us on spotting and resisting manipulation, on defending truth from those who twist it, and on holding on to personal integrity while engaging in group efforts. He showed us how to love our country without holding animosity toward others. He shared how to chase after social justice while still valuing individual freedom. The most vital thing he demonstrated was how one person, dedicated to truth and human dignity, can make a real impact in the fight between liberty and oppression. His life and what he accomplished serve as both inspiration and a roadmap for those who refuse to just go along with the status quo. At the heart of Orwell's teachings is the idea that every single day, each of us has the power to choose between freedom and oppression. Victories aren't forever, and neither are defeats. Each generation must take up the task of creating a society that's fair and free. This is both the challenge and the honor of being human in a world where what lies ahead is shaped by the choices we make. George Orwell shed light on what needs to be done and why it's essential. Now it's up to us to carry that torch in our own ways and in our own times. The battle between truth and authority isn't over. How it ends is in our hands.